England was not kind to men who felt too much, so most of them learned not to feel at all. William Cavendish had learned this lesson better than anyone. He was the 7th Duke of Devonshire, and on the morning of the 14th of March, 1873, he stood at the tall window of his London townhouse on Piccadilly, and watched the street below with the same expression he wore everywhere, which was no expression at all. A cart horse stumbled on the wet cobblestones. A flower seller shouted at a passing cab. 2 women with enormous hats nearly collided at the corner, and then laughed, clutching each other's arms, their breath making little clouds in the cold air. William watched all of this, the way a man watches rain. Present, observing, entirely unmoved. He was 53 years old. He was one of the richest men in England. He owned more land than some small countries. He had a house in London, an estate in Derbyshire called Chatsworth, that contained 175 rooms, a shooting lodge in Scotland, and a considerable amount of property in Ireland that caused him administrative headaches on a quarterly basis. He had 3 children, all of them grown, all of them respectful of him in the careful way that people are respectful of something they are not entirely sure is warm-blooded. He had been called many things in his life. The newspapers called him formidable. His tenants called him fair. His peers in the House of Lords called him reliable, which in the language of aristocratic men was one of the highest possible compliments. The women of London society, in their drawing rooms and behind their fans, called him the Glacier. He was aware of the name. He did not mind it. His valet, a small, efficient man named Perkins who had been in William's service for 11 years and had never once been given a reason to raise his voice, appeared at the door of the dressing room with the morning's appointments written out in a neat hand on cream-colored card. The meeting with your solicitor at 10, Your Grace. Luncheon with Lord Hartington at his club at 12:30. The afternoon is clear. This evening, there is the Pembrokes' dinner at 7, which you confirmed last Tuesday. William did not turn from the window. Is there anything I am supposed to do at the Pembrokes' dinner, besides arrive and leave? Lady Pembroke has placed you between Sir George Ellsworth and the Countess of Derby. Sir George enjoys hunting. The Countess of Derby enjoys almost everything, so conversation on either side should present no difficulty. And the purpose of the dinner? Perkins paused, for precisely the length of time that a discreet man pauses when the question his employer has just asked is one whose answer they already know. It is a social engagement, Your Grace. Yes. William finally turned from the window. That is what I was afraid of. He dressed without particular interest in the result, which was fortunate, because the result was always the same regardless of his interest. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had gone almost entirely silver at the temples. His face was composed in a way that suggested it had been composed for a very long time and had no intention of changing. His eyes were gray, not the interesting kind of gray that poets write about, just gray, the color of a well-made coat, functional, giving nothing away. He had been told, when he was young, that he was handsome. He had filed that information away in the same mental drawer where he kept information about the weather in Devon and the average yield of his barley fields. Accurate, possibly useful at some point, not particularly interesting in itself. The solicitors' meeting at 10 concerned the renegotiation of several tenancy agreements in Derbyshire and a dispute about water rights on the western edge of the Chatsworth estate. William listened, asked precise questions, made 3 decisions, and was finished by 11:15. He arrived at Lord Hartington's club at exactly 12:30. Lord Hartington, Frederick Cavendish actually, though everyone called him Hart, was William's cousin, and one of the only people alive who spoke to William as though he were an ordinary human being, rather than a large and potentially unpredictable piece of furniture. Hart was 20 years younger than William, loud in the cheerful way that comes naturally to men who have never had a reason to be quiet, and constitutionally incapable of sitting still for more than 7 minutes at a stretch. "You look terrible," Hart said, by way of greeting, from across the dining room. "I look precisely as I always look," William said, sitting down. "That's what I said." Hart poured wine, without being asked. "Are you coming to the Pembrokes' tonight? Lady Pembroke has been reorganizing the seating arrangements twice a day for the last week. I think she considers it a kind of art form. I confirmed last Tuesday. Wonderful. There's a girl coming who I think you'll find interesting." William picked up his menu. "I do not find girls interesting." "You used to." I used to find a great many things interesting. He studied the menu for a moment. I will have the lamb. Hart ordered his own food, and then leaned back in his chair, with the comfortable ease of a man who has nowhere to be, and considers that a moral virtue. Her name is Blanche Howard. She's the daughter of Sir Edmund Howard. You know him. He sits on the Committee for Agricultural Reform. Second season. No money worth mentioning, but she's educated, which in her case means she actually reads the books rather than just buying them for the shelves. She argued with Wentworth at the Sutherlands' ball last month about Irish tenancy law. Wentworth came away looking rather shaken. Wentworth is easily shaken. She's not trying to marry a title, Hart said, with the air of someone presenting evidence. That's the unusual part. Every other girl in London is doing mental arithmetic the moment a titled man walks into the room. This one seems to be doing something else entirely. I'm not sure what. William set down his menu. Hart. Yes? I am 53 years old. I have been a widower for 14 years. I attend the social engagements that are required of me. I do not attend them in search of anything. Hart nodded pleasantly. Of course not. Whatever you are suggesting, stop suggesting it. I'm not suggesting anything. Hart reached for his bread roll. I'm simply making conversation. It's what people do at luncheon. William looked at him for a long moment, then picked up his wine. I will have the lamb, he said again, to no one in particular. The afternoon passed, in the predictable way that his afternoons always passed. He read correspondence. He drafted 2 letters. He reviewed a report from his estate manager at Chatsworth about the kitchen garden expansion, which had been ongoing for 3 years, and which he had discovered, to his mild surprise, that he cared about more than he cared about almost any other item in his accounts. There was something about the idea of the kitchen garden, the slow, patient, entirely practical business of growing things in the ground, that William found settling in a way he could not have articulated to anyone, and so had never tried. He arrived at the Pembrokes' house in Grosvenor Square at 7 o'clock exactly. The house was full in the way that fashionable London houses were always full in the season. Not comfortably full, like a home, but strategically full, like a chessboard. Every person positioned with purpose, every conversation carrying subtext. The chandeliers overhead threw light down onto a room full of people who were, in one way or another, performing a version of themselves they considered appropriate for public consumption. William moved through the room in the way he always moved through rooms, at a measured pace, speaking when spoken to, nodding to people he recognized, pausing to exchange a few words with the Foreign Secretary near the fireplace, then with Lady Pembroke herself, who greeted him with the particular species of warmth that hostesses reserved for guests whose attendance elevated the room. He was crossing toward the far end of the drawing room, where Lord Hartington was holding court near a large arrangement of hothouse flowers, when he saw her. He did not register it as seeing her specifically, not at first. What he registered was an absence. Every other woman in the room had, in some small way, noticed him when he entered. He had grown so accustomed to being noticed that the noticing had become invisible, just a texture of the room, like the music playing from the far corner, present but unobtrusive. But the young woman standing near the window in a dress the color of winter sky was talking to old Lord Ashworth about something that appeared to require her full attention, and she did not look up when William entered. She did not look up when the room adjusted slightly around him, the way rooms always did. She did not look up at all. He noticed this the way you notice when a familiar sound suddenly stops. She was not the most striking woman in the room. She was not the youngest. She was perhaps 23, with dark hair pinned up in an arrangement that suggested it had started the evening neater than it currently was, and she was leaning slightly forward as she spoke to Lord Ashworth, with a quality of attention that struck William as unusual, the quality of someone who was actually interested in what they were hearing. Lord Ashworth was 81 years old and spent most evenings telling the same 2 stories about his time in the army. He was not, by any ordinary measure, an interesting conversational partner, and yet this woman was listening to him as though he were. William continued toward Hart, greeted him, accepted a glass of something from a passing footman, and engaged in the expected exchange about the week's parliamentary business. He did not look toward the window again. He looked toward the window 3 more times before dinner was announced. She still did not look at him. At dinner, he was seated between Sir George Ellsworth, who talked about pheasant for 35 minutes, and the Countess of Derby, who talked about everything else. Both conversations required only the minimum of engagement. A nod here, a question there, and William performed his part of them, with the mechanical ease of long practice. Blanche Howard was seated further down the table, between a young barrister William did not know, and the elderly wife of an admiral. He could hear, occasionally, a fragment of her voice, not the words, just the rhythm of it, clear, unhurried, occasionally followed by laughter from whoever she was speaking to, which was not the polite, brief laughter of people being social, but the surprised kind, the kind you cannot quite help. After dinner, in the drawing room, William was talking to Lord Pembroke about a proposed railway expansion, when Hart materialized at his elbow, with the expression of a man who has been waiting patiently to do something, and considers the wait complete. "Come and meet Blanche Howard," Hart said. "I am in a conversation," William said. "Pembroke doesn't mind," Hart said cheerfully. Lord Pembroke, who minded very much, but was not going to say so to Lord Hartington, smiled blandly. Hart steered William across the room with the gentle implacability of a river finding the sea. Blanche Howard was standing near the window again, the same window from before, William noticed, and she was now talking to a man William recognized as a junior minister at the Board of Trade. She was holding a glass of water rather than wine, which was unusual, and she appeared to be in the middle of making a point that the junior minister was receiving, with the expression of a man who is not sure whether to be pleased or alarmed. "Miss Howard," Hart said, "allow me to present my cousin, William Cavendish, Duke of Devonshire." "William, Miss Blanche Howard." The junior minister took the opportunity to excuse himself with visible relief. Blanche Howard turned, and for the first time, she looked at William directly. Her eyes were brown. Not a particularly notable shade of brown, just the ordinary, unself-conscious brown of someone who had never thought about the color of their own eyes. She looked at him with a frank, assessing quality that William found, to his considerable surprise, slightly uncomfortable. Not rude, just honest, in the way that very few people ever were with him. "How do you do?" William said. "Very well, thank you," she said. And then, because apparently she had not finished the thought she had been midway through when Hart arrived. "The difficulty with the new poor relief proposal isn't the funding structure, it's the eligibility criteria. They've written it so narrowly that half the people it's meant to help won't qualify." She said this to Hart, who nodded, as though he had been part of the conversation the entire time, which he hadn't. "That's been raised in committee," Hart said. "Has it been addressed in committee, or just raised?" she asked. Hart opened his mouth and then closed it again. William, without particularly deciding to, said, "Raised. They tabled the amendment until the autumn session." Blanche Howard looked at him again. "Why autumn?" "Procedural concerns about the timeline of the supplementary budget." "That seems like a convenient excuse." "Most procedural concerns are," William said. She looked at him for a moment longer, not with admiration, not with the careful warmth that people usually directed at him, with something more like assessment, the look of someone trying to determine whether something is actually what it appears to be, or something else entirely. Then she turned back to Hart and asked about the committee membership, and William stood where he was and found, quite unexpectedly, that he did not want to walk away. He stayed in the conversation for another 20 minutes. He had not intended to. She asked more questions about the poor relief bill than he had ever heard anyone ask about any piece of legislation in a drawing room. She was not performing interest. She was not asking questions because she thought it would make her seem attractive or clever. She was asking because she wanted to know the answers. At one point, she reached out and took a small pastry from a passing tray, ate it without interrupting what she was saying, and left a small flake of it on her lower lip for approximately 30 seconds, before noticing it and removing it with complete composure, as though this were a perfectly normal thing to happen, and no one need comment on it. William had attended approximately 900 social events in the last 20 years. He could not remember the last time he had noticed what anyone ate. When the evening ended, he collected his hat and coat in the entrance hall, and waited while the carriages were called. Hart appeared beside him, wearing the expression of a man who was working very hard not to look pleased with himself. "Well?" Hart said. "Well what?" William said. "Did you find her interesting?" William settled his hat and looked straight ahead. The cold air came in through the open front door, smelling of horses and rain, and the particular smell of a London night in March. "I said I would have the lamb," he said, "at luncheon. I don't believe I ever actually received it." Hart stared at him. Then he laughed. "The real kind, the surprised kind. You received it. You ate half of it and said the rosemary was too heavy." William thought about this. "So I did," he said. His carriage arrived. He climbed in, and the door closed, and the carriage moved through the dark streets toward Piccadilly. He sat in the dark interior and looked out at the lit windows of the houses they passed, each one containing its arrangement of lives and conversations and small dramas, and he thought about nothing in particular. That was what he told himself. He thought about nothing in particular. The small flake of pastry on her lower lip was a very specific kind of nothing. He arrived home at 11:20. He told Perkins the evening had been adequate. He climbed the stairs, and at the top he paused for a moment at the window on the landing, which overlooked the back garden, just a square of London ground with some old yew hedges and a stone path that nobody used much. There was nothing to see in the dark. He stood there for a moment anyway. Then he went to bed, and lay in the dark, and was quite certain that he would not think about Blanche Howard again after tonight. She was a minor baronet's daughter, with political opinions and pastry on her face, and she had not once looked at him the way that everyone else in England looked at him, and that was simply an interesting anomaly, and nothing more. He was quite certain about this. He was wrong. In the morning he found himself, while reviewing the estate accounts, thinking about the poor relief eligibility criteria, and whether there was a viable amendment that could be attached to the supplementary budget, rather than waiting for the autumn session. He thought about this for a very long time. Then he realized what he was thinking about, and why, and set the accounts aside, and went to stand at the window again. The cart horse was back on the street below. It was a brown horse with a philosophical expression, and it was pulling a delivery cart with admirable persistence, and William watched it for a full 5 minutes, before he admitted to himself that he was not actually thinking about the poor relief bill. He was thinking about the quality of attention with which Blanche Howard listened to things. He was 53 years old. He had been called the Glacier by every drawing room in London. He had buried a wife and raised 3 children and run an estate of 40,000 acres and served in 3 parliamentary sessions and felt, for 14 years, precisely nothing beyond the competent discharge of his considerable duties. He picked up the estate accounts again. He set them down again. Outside, the brown horse turned the corner and disappeared, and the street went on doing what streets do, and William Cavendish stood at his window in the gray March morning and felt, somewhere in the locked architecture of his chest, something shift slightly, not open, not crack. Shift. As if something that had been still for a very long time had remembered, briefly, that it was not stone after all. He did not know what to do with this information. He did what he always did, with things he did not know what to do with. He put on his coat and went to attend to his obligations, and he carried the shift with him, small and unwelcome, and entirely impossible to put down, all the way through the rest of the morning, and into the afternoon, and through dinner that evening, and into the next day, which was the first day in 14 years that had felt, from its very beginning, faintly different from all the ones before it. He did not yet understand why. He would, eventually. But understanding was some distance away yet, and the distance would cost him considerably more than he expected, and the price would be worth every penny of it. He just did not know that yet. 3 days after the Pembrokes' dinner, a letter arrived at the desk of Sir Edmund Howard's house in Portman Square, addressed in a careful hand to his daughter. Blanche Howard read it at breakfast, while her mother discussed the merits of several upcoming social engagements, with the focused dedication of a military strategist planning a campaign. The letter was from her friend Cecily Vane, who had married a solicitor the previous year and now lived in a pleasant house in Chelsea, and wrote long letters that made Blanche feel both fond of her and mildly exhausted. Cecily wanted to know everything about the Pembrokes' dinner. She had heard, from someone who had heard from someone else, that the Duke of Devonshire had spent 20 minutes in conversation with Blanche. 20 minutes. With the Duke. The Glacier himself. Cecily underlined the word 20 twice, and drew a small star next to it. Blanche folded the letter and put it beside her teacup and returned her attention to her toast. "You're not listening," her mother said. "I'm listening," Blanche said. "You were saying that the Hartleys' card party is on Tuesday. and the subscription concert is Thursday, and you think we should attend both." Her mother, who was a small, precise woman named Margaret Howard, who had decided when Blanche was approximately 7 years old that her daughter was going to require considerably more management than she had anticipated, gave her the look she reserved for moments of parental concern, which on Margaret Howard's face looked somewhat like a bird assessing whether a particular piece of ground was worth landing on. "Lady Pembroke mentioned to Mrs. Hartley that the Duke of Devonshire found you very engaging," Margaret Howard said. "That seems unlikely," Blanche said, spreading marmalade with methodical care. "He was mostly talking about parliamentary procedure." "Blanche." Her mother set down her own cup. "The Duke of Devonshire spoke to you for 20 minutes. I know. We've established the length. He never speaks to anyone for 20 minutes. He barely speaks to anyone for 2. Blanche ate her toast. "He was speaking to Hart for most of it. I was just present." "You are never just present anywhere," her mother said, with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent 23 years being the parent of someone constitutionally incapable of being merely decorative. "You are always doing something. Whatever you were doing on Friday evening, the Duke of Devonshire noticed it." Blanche thought about this for a moment. She thought about the conversation at the window, which had started with the poor relief bill and had gone to the autumn parliamentary session, and had then, briefly, touched on something else. She couldn't quite recall what now, only that she had looked at him at some point and found, to her mild surprise, that he was not what she had expected. She had expected the glacier. Everyone talked about the glacier. She had expected a man like a closed door, polite enough to stand in front of, but offering no evidence that anything interesting lay behind it. What she had found instead was a man who answered her questions as though she were capable of understanding the answers, which in her experience was not something all men automatically assumed. He had not explained things to her. He had just told her, cleanly and without decoration, what she had asked to know. This had been, she admitted to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts, surprisingly pleasant. "He's a very large man," she said, which was not what she meant to say. Her mother blinked. "He's a duke." "Yes, and also very large. Physically, he stands as though he's not certain how much space he's entitled to take up." She paused. "Actually, that's not quite right. He stands as though he's decided on a specific amount of space and has no intention of taking more, which is different." She picked up Cecily's letter. "I'm going to write back to Cecily." "Blanche." Her mother's voice carried the weight of a woman who has many things she wishes to say and is selecting among them carefully. "The Duke of Devonshire is a widower. He is one of the most eligible men in England. He is wealthy and respected, and by all accounts a man of considerable honor, if he has taken notice of you." "I don't want to be noticed," Blanche said. She said it without heat, almost absently, as though it were simply a true thing she was reporting, like the weather. "I want to be known. Those are different things. Being noticed means someone has seen what I look like from across a room. Being known means someone has paid attention to what I think." She stood, folding Cecily's letter. "I'm not certain those are things the Duke of Devonshire has any particular interest in offering." She went to the small sitting room at the back of the house, where she did her reading, and her writing, and her thinking, and she sat down at the desk and looked out at the narrow strip of London garden behind the house for a while. She thought, briefly, about the Duke. He had gray eyes. She had not expected that, somehow. Not the color, but the quality of them. They were watchful eyes. Not suspicious watchful, not calculating watchful. More the way a person watches something they are trying to understand, something they are approaching carefully because they suspect it might matter. She had caught him doing this at the dinner table. She had been talking to the Admiral's wife about a novel they had both apparently read, and she had looked up and found the Duke watching her from further down the table, and it had lasted only a second before he looked away, but the quality of that second had stayed with her for the rest of the evening. She did not know what to call it. She took out a sheet of paper and began to write to Cecily. She wrote that the dinner had been pleasant. She wrote that Lord Hartington was very funny and that the evening's food was excellent. She wrote that the poor relief bill was in a worse state than the newspapers suggested and that someone ought to put pressure on the committee before autumn. She wrote, at the very end, almost as an afterthought, "The Duke of Devonshire is nothing like people say, or possibly exactly like people say, but the thing they're describing is not the thing I would describe. He listens as though he means it. I am not sure what to do with that. She folded the letter and addressed it, and set it for the afternoon post. Then she opened the book she had been reading, a translation of Schopenhauer that she had borrowed from her father's study and had not yet returned, largely because her father had not yet noticed it was gone, and settled into her chair, and read, and thought about entropy, and the nature of will, and the way that things that seem completely still are often, underneath, moving in ways that cannot be seen yet. She was not thinking about the Duke. She was almost entirely not thinking about the Duke. The following Tuesday, she attended the Hartleys' card party. It was not a large gathering, about 30 people in a house on Brook Street that was comfortable rather than grand, with good fires in all the rooms, and a table of excellent cold supper laid out in the dining room. Blanche played cards badly and cheerfully, with a group that included Cecily, who had come up from Chelsea for the week, and two of the Hartley daughters, who were pleasant girls, with a great deal of energy, and very little interest in Schopenhauer. She was in the middle of losing a hand with complete composure, when Cecily, who was sitting beside her, and therefore had an excellent view of the door, made a sound that was not quite a word. Blanche looked up. The Duke of Devonshire was standing in the entrance to the card room, talking to their host. He had not seen her yet. He was wearing dark evening clothes with the same absence of vanity that she had noticed at the Pembrokes. The clothes were correct, even elegant, but they were clearly not something he had thought about very much. He was talking to Mr. Hartley, with the contained, economical quality she was beginning to recognize as his particular mode. Not cold exactly, but conserving, as though he had decided at some point that he had a certain amount of warmth, and had committed to spending it carefully. "That's the Duke," Cecily said, very quietly, as though Blanche might not have noticed. "I see him," Blanche said. "He's looking at you," Cecily said. Blanche looked down at her cards. He was not looking at her. He was talking to Mr. Hartley. She knew because she was not looking at him, but she knew anyway, in the specific way you know things that you are pretending not to know. She lost the hand. She dealt the next one. 20 minutes later, she was at the supper table, collecting a plate with the purposeful attitude of someone who takes cold supper seriously, when she became aware of the Duke standing 2 feet to her left and reaching, without particular ceremony, for the same serving spoon she was about to pick up. "I apologize," he said, and stepped back. "Please don't," she said, and took the spoon and served herself and handed it to him. "How are the parliamentary committees progressing?" she asked, because it was the most natural question in the world, and also because she could not immediately think of anything else. He looked at her for a moment, with the watchful quality she remembered. "Slowly," he said. "As always, the eligibility criteria for the poor relief bill are still unresolved." "I've been thinking about that," she said. "Have you? There's a case to be made for a needs-based, rather than category-based eligibility framework. It would be harder to administer, but it would prevent the exclusion problem." He was quiet for a moment, and she had a sudden, brief worry that she had been presumptuous, that he was going to give her the look that men sometimes gave her when she said something they had not expected from a woman at a supper table, the look that was nominally polite but contained, somewhere inside it, a gentle and condescending surprise. He did not give her that look. "There have been 2 attempts at needs-based frameworks in the last 15 years, he said. Both collapsed at the implementation stage, because the local administration structures weren't capable of handling the assessment process. The question isn't just what the criteria should be, but who is equipped to apply them." She thought about this. "So the problem isn't the policy. The problem is the infrastructure." "The problem is usually the infrastructure," he said. "The policy is the easy part." She looked at him. He was looking at the supper table, helping himself to something from a dish, with the same economical attention he gave to everything. Present, but not demanding anything in return for his presence. Just there. Just thinking. "That's a rather disheartening way of looking at things," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "but it's accurate." She found herself smiling, not the performed, careful smile that she brought to social engagements like a tool, but the actual one, the small, private one that appeared when something was genuinely interesting. She covered it immediately by looking down at her plate. When she looked up again, the Duke was looking at her with an expression that she could not quite categorize. It lasted for only a moment, less than a moment, really. just the briefest fraction of attention. And then it was gone, and he was looking at the supper table again, and the evening continued. She told Cecily nothing specific about the exchange, only that the supper had been excellent. Cecily looked at her with the bright, knowing attention of a woman who has been her friend for 8 years, and is perfectly capable of reading the gap between what Blanche says and what Blanche means. "You're doing it again," Cecily said. "Doing what?" Blanche said. "The thing where you pretend something isn't interesting when it clearly is." "The supper was excellent," Blanche said. "The salmon, in particular." Cecily gave her a long look and then wisely let it go. On the carriage ride home, sitting beside her mother in the dark interior, with the gas lamps flickering past the windows, Blanche Howard looked out at the passing streets and thought, with more honesty than she usually permitted herself, about what it meant to be in a conversation with someone who answered you, as though your questions mattered, as though you were worth the effort of a real answer, as though the fact that you had asked something was, itself, something of value. It was a small thing. She knew it was a small thing. But small things, in her experience, were often the ones that counted. She said nothing about this to her mother. She looked out at the dark London streets and let the carriage take her home, and she folded the thought away in the careful place she kept thoughts that she was not yet ready to do anything with. But she did not forget it. She never forgot things that mattered, even when she was very busy pretending they didn't. William Cavendish had not intended to go to the Hartleys' card party. He had looked at his list of obligations for the week, and the Hartleys' card party had been on it, and he had thought, briefly, about sending his regrets. Then Hart had mentioned it at their Thursday luncheon, saying that Miss Howard was likely to attend, and William had said, very evenly, that that was of no particular interest to him, and he had thought about it for the rest of the afternoon, and had gone. He was aware, as a general principle, that this was not a sequence of events that reflected especially well on him. He was also aware that he was attending a greater number of social engagements than he had in the previous several years combined, and that this fact was not lost on Perkins, who said nothing about it, but laid out his evening clothes each night, with the expression of a man who is very carefully not commenting on anything. The morning after the Hartleys' card party, William sat at his desk with the parliamentary papers relating to the Poor Relief Bill, and read them for the first time with genuine attention. She was right about the eligibility criteria. He had known they were a problem, but he had known it in the abstract, detached way that he knew about many things that were problems but were not, in the immediate moment, his problems to solve. She had said the word exclusion, and he had understood, in a sudden and specific way that he hadn't before, what the criteria actually meant for the people they were supposed to help. Needs-based rather than category-based. He wrote a note to his secretary to arrange a meeting with the committee chairman. He then sat and looked at the wall for a while. He had been a widower for 14 years. He had been, in that time, a conscientious father, a capable administrator, a reliable public servant, and a man who had not once, in all of that time, wanted anything for himself that went beyond the next obligation. He had not thought of this as deprivation. He had thought of it as discipline, as the appropriate management of a life that had been, in its most important part, already completed. Eleanor had died on the 14th of June, 1859. She had been 31 years old, and she had been the only person who had ever treated William Cavendish as though he were something other than a title, a duty, and a pair of gray eyes. And when she went, she took with her the only place he had ever fully inhabited. He had continued existing in all the correct ways. He had just done it from a very long distance. This was not, he understood, a sustainable arrangement indefinitely. He was not so lacking in self-awareness that he did not know what he had done, and why, and what the cost of it had been. He simply had not, until now, encountered anything that made the cost feel worth examining. He picked up the parliamentary papers again. He was going to the Sutherland lecture on Friday evening. Hart had mentioned, in passing, that Blanche Howard was usually interested in that sort of thing. William had said nothing in response to this information, and had noted it in a part of his mind that he preferred not to examine too closely. He was 53 years old. He was going to a lecture. On Friday evening, he arrived at the Sutherlands' house in Park Lane at 7:30. The lecture was being given by a botanist from the Royal Society, who had spent 3 years studying the root systems of trees, which was exactly the kind of topic that attracted a specific kind of person to an evening gathering. The kind who actually read the books they displayed, and asked questions that took longer than the answer they had been given, and were likely to still be arguing about the implications in the carriage on the way home. He was shown into the drawing room and scanned it with a deliberateness that he did not allow to appear on his face. She was not there yet. He spoke to Lord Sutherland, and then to a professor from Oxford whose name he did not catch, and then to 3 other people in the careful, economical way he always spoke to people at gatherings, and all the while he was aware, in a way he had not been aware of a room since he was a very young man, of the door. At 10 minutes to 8, Blanche Howard came in with the Countess of Derby. She was wearing something dark blue, and she looked around the room with open curiosity. Not the managed, careful curiosity of someone deciding who to be seen speaking to, but the genuine kind, the kind that goes where it wants without calculation. Her eyes found him. She looked at him with the same frank, direct quality as before, not warm, not cold, just clear, as though she were simply registering a fact. Then she smiled, very slightly. The small, private one. And then it was gone, and she turned to say something to the Countess of Derby, and the room continued. William turned back to his conversation with the Oxford professor, which was about the taxonomy of ferns, and said something coherent about ferns, which surprised him somewhat. He sat 2 rows behind her during the lecture. The botanist was a good speaker, clear and specific, and not precious about the complexity of what he had found in his years of research. He talked about the way trees and old-growth forests are connected underground through a network of fungal threads, passing nutrients to each other, particularly to trees that are dying or under stress. He had drawings. He had data. He had the good academic habit of being honest about what he did not yet know. Blanche Howard was paying attention in the forward-leaning way she had, as if she were trying to get closer to the information, as if distance were an impediment she was compensating for. At one point, she wrote something in the small notebook she had brought, and William found himself wondering what she had written. At question time, she asked whether there was evidence that the nutrient sharing was intentional, whether the word intentional was even applicable to trees, or whether it was simply a consequence of the network existing and doing what networks do. The botanist said that was an excellent question, and that the honest answer was that they didn't know yet. He said the word intentional was probably not applicable in the way it applied to human beings, but that the tree that was dying did, consistently, receive more than it sent, which was either intention or something that looked very much like it. Blanche Howard wrote something else in her notebook. William sat in his chair 2 rows back and looked at the back of her head, and thought that he had not, in 14 years, wanted to know what someone had written in their private notes. After the lecture, in the general conversation that followed, he found himself near her without quite deciding to be. She was talking to the botanist directly, with the absorbed focus of someone who has a list of follow-up questions and is going to get through all of them before the evening ends. He waited. Eventually she looked around and found him still there. The nutrient sharing, she said, without preamble, as though they had been in the middle of a conversation. He didn't mention whether there are trees that take without giving, whether the network can be exploited. I wondered that too, William said. She looked at him with something that might have been surprise, very briefly. I thought you might have. You were leaning forward when he got to the data on the stressed trees. She paused. I saw you in the audience. I was 2 rows behind you, he said. I know. You have a very specific quality of paying attention. It's rather loud. This was, he thought, a sentence that had never been said to him before in his life. Loud, he repeated. You pay attention the way most people talk, she said. It takes up space. She said this not unkindly, just as though she were describing an observable phenomenon. Then she looked back at the botanist, who was being pulled into another conversation, and she said, half to herself, I want to go and look at tree roots properly, somewhere old. That's a very specific aspiration. I have a great many specific aspirations. She turned back to him, and there it was again. That look, the one he had no category for. Do you have specific aspirations, I mean? Beyond the ones that come with the title. No one had asked him that in 14 years, possibly longer. I have been expanding the kitchen garden at Chatsworth, he said, which was not an answer to the question she had asked, and yet somehow was. She looked at him for a long moment, and he had the very strange and uncomfortable sensation of being actually seen, not the title, Not the coat, not the particular quality of silence he wore like armor, but something underneath all of it. Some small and neglected thing that had been sitting very quietly in the dark for a very long time, waiting. "I should like to see a kitchen garden that a man like you cares about," she said. And then, apparently having decided that this was enough for one evening, she thanked him for the conversation and went to collect the Countess of Derby and her coat, and was gone. William stood where she had left him. The room continued around him. People talked. The botanist was still answering questions. The gas lamps threw warm light across the bookshelves and the curtains and the animated faces of people who had genuinely enjoyed the last 2 hours. William stood there and felt the shift again. Not small this time, not the slight hesitant movement of something remembering it was not stone. Something larger, something that had the quality, in his chest, of a door. Very old, very heavy, almost certainly stuck, on the very first morning of being tested. Not open. Not yet. But trying. April came in, wet and gray, and absolutely indifferent to the needs of the London season, which continued regardless. The parks were muddy, the sky was low, and the color of cold steel. The fashionable streets of Mayfair and Belgravia were full of carriages, splashing through puddles, and women holding their hems, and men who had decided that umbrellas were undignified and were being rained on as a consequence. Blanche Howard noticed the April rain, with the uncomplicated pleasure she brought to any weather that was interesting to look at. She watched it from the sitting-room window while working through a letter from her father's oldest friend, a retired judge named Henry Alcott, who wrote to her every month from his house in Bath, with his opinions on current legislation, and his increasing dissatisfaction with his physician, and whose letters she always answered in full. She was halfway through a paragraph on the Criminal Law Amendment Bill when her mother appeared in the doorway. "The Duke of Devonshire has called," Margaret Howard said. Blanche's pen stopped. She looked up. Her mother was wearing an expression that Blanche had never seen on her face before, which was saying something, because Margaret Howard had a very full range of expressions, and deployed them all with precision. This one appeared to be composed of equal parts triumph and terror, which was not a combination that occurred naturally on most human faces, but her mother had always been an exceptional woman. "He's called?" Blanche said. "He is in the drawing room," her mother said, "and he has asked to see you." Men in 1873 did not simply arrive at a young woman's house and ask to see her, without a very clear understanding of what that meant. It meant something. It meant something specific and significant, and the entire neighborhood probably already knew about it, because there was a very distinctive ducal crest on the carriage currently parked outside the front door. Blanche put the letter to Judge Alcott face down on the desk. She thought, briefly, of running through her options. She could be unwell. She could be out. She could have their housekeeper send her excuses. She could... She stood up, smoothed her dress, and went downstairs. He was standing at the window of the drawing room, which she was beginning to think was simply where he existed. Men like him apparently gravitated to windows the way plants gravitated to light, looking out at the world from behind glass with a kind of watchful stillness. He turned when she came in. There was something different about him today. She could not immediately identify what it was. He was wearing the same quality of clothes, the same contained, economical posture. But there was something in his face, some very small and carefully managed thing, that had not been there in the same way at the other occasions where she had seen him. He looked, she thought, like a man who had made a decision that cost him something. "Miss Howard," he said. "Your Grace," she said, and gestured to the chair by the fireplace, and sat down opposite him, and waited. He sat. He did not immediately speak, which was both consistent with everything she had observed about him and somewhat unnerving. He looked at his hands for a moment, which surprised her. It seemed too human a gesture for a man usually so still. "I have been to 4 events this month," he said finally, "in addition to those obligations which are simply required of me." "I know," she said. "People talk. I am aware that people talk." He looked up. "I am also aware that my attendance at a disproportionate number of events in a short period has been noticed and is being interpreted in a particular way, and I would prefer, if possible, to not allow a situation to develop in which you are the subject of that interpretation, without having been asked." She looked at him. Outside, the rain came down on the London street, steady and unhurried. "You're here," she said slowly, "to ask me how I feel about the fact that you've been going to the same places I've been going." "Yes," he said. "That is, I believe, an accurate summary. And if I tell you that I would prefer you not to attend events primarily because I'm attending them?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then I would stop." She studied him. He met her gaze with the directness she had come to recognize, but underneath it now was something else, the very faint quality of someone holding still, because movement might give too much away. "And if I don't tell you that," she said. The silence was perhaps 4 seconds long. In those 4 seconds, something in his face did something very small and very significant. The difference between a door that is closed and a door that is closed but unlocked. "Then I would ask," he said, "whether you would do me the honor of walking with me in the park when the weather permits, and of attending, with your family, Chatsworth in June, for the summer gathering I host each year." Blanche Howard sat in her drawing room in Portman Square in the gray April morning and looked at William Cavendish, and thought about all the things she had told herself, about what she did and did not want, about being known rather than noticed, about what a life in a house with 175 rooms would cost a woman who needed space to think. She thought about a kitchen garden, about trees feeding each other underground, about a man who stood at windows as though he were not certain what he was looking for, but had decided to keep looking anyway. "The park," she said, "when the weather permits." She paused. "Chatsworth, I will put to my parents. That is their decision." "Of course," he said. "And," she said, "I should tell you, I am not good at being a duchess. By which I mean, I suspect I would find the performance of it very difficult. The correct rooms, and the correct expressions, and the constant public accounting of oneself. I'm not saying this to alarm you. I'm saying it because I think you should know what kind of person I am before any further conclusions are drawn." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the rain continued its gray, honest work on the London street. "Eleanor, my wife, used to say something similar," he said, and his voice was very even, and she understood that this was not a comparison, but a recognition. She said that the title was a coat, that she would wear it when the occasion required it, and hang it up the rest of the time. He paused. "I thought about that a great deal after she died." The room was very quiet. "I am sorry," Blanche said, meaning it in the complete and simple way. "About your wife." "Yes," he said. "Thank you." They sat for a moment in the quiet, with the rain outside, and the fire in the grate, and the 14 years between them, like a country that had its own geography, and its own particular kind of weather, not something to cross quickly, not something to pretend wasn't there, but, possibly, something that could be crossed. "The park," Blanche said again, "when the weather permits." "When the weather permits," he agreed. He stood, and she stood, and he took her hand very briefly in the formal way, the correct way, and looked at her with the gray, watchful eyes that she had been thinking about, she admitted now, since the first evening she had met him. He left. She stood in the drawing room and listened to the front door close, and the sound of the carriage on the wet street, and then the receding sound of hooves on cobblestones, until there was only the fire and the rain. Her mother appeared in the doorway. "Well?" Margaret Howard said, at approximately the volume of someone trying very hard not to shout. "The weather," Blanche said, "is expected to improve by Thursday." Her mother stared at her. "We are going for a walk in the park," Blanche said, "on Thursday, if the weather permits." She picked up her skirt and moved toward the stairs. "I need to finish my letter to Judge Alcott." "Blanche. He cares about a kitchen garden," she said, at the top of the stairs, half to herself. "Of all things." She went to her room and sat at her window and watched the rain come down on the square below, and thought about the way he had said Eleanor's name, simply, without flinching, with the quiet honesty of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has, perhaps, begun to wonder whether he is required to carry it alone forever. She did not think he was required to. She did not yet know what to do with that thought. But she was not, she realized, afraid of it. Which was, for Blanche Howard, who was afraid of very few things, and honest about almost all of them, the clearest possible signal of where the next chapter of her life was going to take her. Whether or not she was ready, she suspected she was. She was almost always ready for the things she pretended to hesitate about. On Thursday, the weather permitted. The park in the morning was the kind of clean and light-washed thing that London sometimes managed to be in the spring, after the rain has gone through and left the air smelling of earth and wet grass and, faintly, of the flowers that the gardeners had put in along the path near the water. The sky was a pale, watery blue, high and clear, and the trees along the path were producing their careful new leaves, the delicate yellow-green kind, the kind that only lasts about 2 weeks before it deepens into summer, and you forget it was ever that particular tentative shade of new. Blanche Howard arrived at the agreed gate of Hyde Park at 10 o'clock with her chaperone, an older woman named Mrs. Agnes Peel, who had been with the Howard family for 6 years, and had developed, over the course of those years, the strategic skill of walking at precisely the right distance behind Blanche to satisfy propriety, while also remaining comfortably out of earshot of anything interesting. The Duke of Devonshire was already there. He was standing by the gate in the morning light, and he looked. She noticed immediately, and noted to herself with some interest, less defended than he usually did. Not unguarded exactly, but the elaborate armor of the formal social setting was not fully deployed at 10 in the morning in a park, and what remained was something quieter and, she thought, more real. He greeted her correctly, greeted Mrs. Peel, and they set off down the path. For the first few minutes they walked in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. She had not been sure, coming here, what they would talk about, what a man like him talked about, when the scaffolding of a social event was removed, and it was simply 2 people on a path, with the spring light coming through the new leaves. He surprised her. "The kitchen garden at Chatsworth," he said, without particular preamble, "covers approximately 2 acres. There are sections my head gardener has managed for longer than I have owned the property. He has opinions about everything. He refuses to plant anything he considers frivolous." "What does he consider frivolous?" "Flowers that cannot be eaten." "He sounds like a very practical man," she said. "He is rather annoyed with me," William said. "I told him last autumn that I wanted to add a section for plants that are primarily decorative. He has not yet forgiven me." She looked at him. He was not smiling, exactly, but there was something in the corner of his expression that was the structural prerequisite for a smile. The thing that comes just before. The thing that shows the machinery is there, even if the result hasn't quite arrived. "Why do you want decorative plants?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the path. "My wife planted them," he said. "Not in that particular garden, in the small garden off the east wing, which is mostly gone now. But she liked plants that served no purpose beyond being themselves. I thought about adding them to the kitchen garden as a way of—" He stopped. "I am not sure exactly why, now that I say it aloud." "A way of remembering her," Blanche said, very simply. "Yes." He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, but was the effect that surprise leaves behind. "Yes, I think that was it." They walked for a moment, in the quiet, between those words, and whatever came next. "What was she like?" Blanche asked. It was a direct question. She knew it was a direct question. She also knew that she was not capable of asking the indirect version, and that he, she suspected, would not actually prefer it. He was quiet long enough that she wondered if she had miscalculated. Then he said, She did not tolerate unnecessary words. If she had something to say, she said it. And if she did not, she was quiet, and the silence was never uncomfortable. A pause. She had very little patience for the way that society required you to perform your own emotions in the correct way, rather than simply having them. She found the gap between what people felt and what they were permitted to express very wearing. I think it wore her down, over the years. Blanche thought about this. "And you, did it wear you down?" "I became very good at not feeling things that would then require expression," he said, which is a different response to the same problem. She looked at him walking beside her in the morning light, this very large, very careful, very contained man who had just said, as cleanly as though he were reporting a fact about the parliamentary committee structure, that he had spent the better part of his adult life shutting down his own interior. "That sounds exhausting," she said. He glanced at her. "It is, actually, very restful. Once you've done it long enough." "I don't believe you," she said. "A beat." "No," he said, after a moment. I don't entirely believe myself." They turned at the end of the path and began to walk back, and the conversation went somewhere else. The park, the Royal Society lecture, a proposal in the Lords that she had read about in her father's newspaper, which she had opinions on, and which he listened to with the attention she had come to expect from him, the attention that took up space. She told him about Judge Alcott's letters. He asked about the judge's views on the recent criminal law reforms, which were specific and interested questions, not the polite questions people ask to give the appearance of listening. She told him about the argument she had made to her father last year, about the state of women's education, and the argument she had lost, and the book she had subsequently written a very long letter to a member of Parliament about, which her father had found on the hall table before she could post it, and had made her rewrite in considerably more diplomatic language. He laughed. It was a very short laugh, just a single, quiet breath of it, but it was real. The first completely uncontrolled thing she had heard from him. He looked, for approximately 3 seconds, like a different man. Younger, less sculpted by the long years of keeping himself in his correct proportions. She stored that 3 seconds the way she stored things she intended to return to. When they reached the gate where they had started, Mrs. Peel materialized at a respectful distance, and the formal world reassembled around them. He thanked her for the walk. She thanked him for the invitation. The correct words in the correct order, observed by the correct people. But as he was leaving, he paused. "The gathering at Chatsworth," he said, "the second week of June. I hope your parents will permit it." "I will ask," she said. "There is a kitchen garden," he said. "I would like to show it to you." "I know," she said. "You mentioned." "I mention it again," he said, "because I mean it." She looked at him. The morning light was very clear. The new leaves moved slightly in a breeze, off the water. "I understood you the first time," she said. He nodded, once, and walked away toward his carriage, and she watched him go with Mrs. Peel at her elbow, and she thought about a kitchen garden in Derbyshire, and a head gardener who didn't like decorative plants, and a man who had planted them anyway, in memory of someone he had loved, for reasons he couldn't entirely articulate, until someone asked him directly. She was going to Chatsworth in June. She had decided this the moment he said kitchen garden the first time, and had then spent approximately 3 weeks pretending she hadn't. The pretending was, she now admitted to herself, over. The spring light was on the path, and the new leaves were doing their brief, perfect work in the trees, and she walked back through the park beside Mrs. Peel and thought about the specific and unreasonable pleasure of being listened to by someone who meant it. It was, she thought, a dangerous pleasure. The most dangerous kind. The kind that is very hard to give up once you have had it. The gossip moved, as London gossip always moved, about 48 hours faster than the events it described. By the time Blanche Howard and the Duke of Devonshire had completed their second walk in Hyde Park, the conversation in the drawing rooms and at the luncheon tables, and in the card rooms of fashionable London, had already decided what it meant, explained why, assigned motivations to both parties, expressed opinions on the suitability of the match, and begun quietly quarreling with itself about the details. The charitable version said that the Duke, after 14 years of honorable solitude, had at last found a woman of sufficient quality to draw him out of his reserve. This version was popular among people who liked the Duke, which was most people who had ever needed anything from him, and found him consistent, fair, and not given to the small cruelties that some men in his position considered a natural benefit of rank. The less charitable version said that Blanche Howard had managed, through means not entirely clear but probably calculated, to capture the attention of the most eligible widower in England. This version was popular among people who had daughters of their own who were not Blanche Howard, and who required, therefore, an explanation for why the Duke had looked past their daughters and toward this particular girl of modest family and no particular fortune. Blanche was aware of both versions. She was aware in the way she was always aware of things people assumed she didn't notice, which was all of them. She sat across the breakfast table from her mother on a Tuesday morning in the last week of May, and listened to Margaret Howard's careful account of what Lady Pembroke had said to Mrs. Hartley, and what Mrs. Hartley had reportedly said in response, and what the consequences of those two statements were likely to be for the general social atmosphere around the question of the Duke and Miss Howard. "They are calling you ambitious," her mother said, with the tone of a woman reporting enemy movements. "I know," Blanche said. "Lady Weston said at the Alcott's dinner on Friday." "I know what Lady Weston said," Blanche said. "Mrs. Peel told me on Saturday." And? "And Lady Weston is a woman with 3 unmarried daughters and the calculating eye of someone who has spent 7 years working out exactly how much the marriage market costs and who is to blame when the investment doesn't produce the expected return." Blanche poured herself more tea. "She's not wrong that I'm ambitious. She's wrong about what I'm ambitious for." Her mother looked at her. "What are you ambitious for?" Blanche put down the teapot and looked at her cup and said, with the honest bluntness that was her only real mode, "I want to talk about things that matter, with someone who listens, as though they matter. I want a life where my mind is not a polite inconvenience that I'm expected to manage and contain." She paused. "The Duke of Devonshire listens to me. He argues with me. He asks me what I think about things and then waits for the actual answer, instead of the socially comfortable one." She picked up her cup. "That is more than most women in this city are being offered by the men they're being paired with, and I will not apologize for wanting it." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "You are also, I think, a little in love with him." Blanche looked at her. She thought about the walks. She thought about the way he had looked when he laughed, briefly, at the story of the letter to the Member of Parliament. She thought about the way he said things, the specific economy of it, the decision he clearly made each time to say the exact thing he meant, and no more. She thought about his hands, which were large and calloused, in a way that surprised her for a man of his rank, until she remembered the kitchen garden. "I don't know," she said, which was the most honest answer she had. "Yes, you do," her mother said, with the certainty of a woman who has known her daughter for 23 years. Blanche opened her mouth, and then closed it again. Outside, the May morning was warm and clear, the first genuinely warm morning after a cold spring, and the square below the window was full of the kind of light that makes everything look briefly possible. "The Chatsworth invitation arrived this morning," her mother said. "From the Duke's secretary, a house party, 2nd week of June, for a duration of 8 days. Formal invitation to yourself, and to me, and to your father." Blanche looked up. "Your father," her mother said, with careful precision, "has already accepted." Sir Edmund Howard was not a man who moved quickly, or expressed enthusiasm about very much, so this information landed with the weight of something significant. "He accepted," Blanche said, "yesterday, without consulting me, which is entirely in character." Her mother folded her hands on the table, in the way she did when she had arrived at a conclusion, and was presenting it as a settled matter. "We are going to Chatsworth." Blanche looked out the window at the May morning. She thought about a 2-acre kitchen garden in Derbyshire. She thought about a head gardener who distrusted decorative plants. She thought about a house with 175 rooms, and a man who moved through all of them, with the careful economy of someone who had decided, at some point, that he deserved to take up as little space as possible. She thought about the decorative garden he was planting anyway, in memory of Eleanor. "Yes," she said, "we are." She was not afraid. She had told the Duke she was not afraid of the role, only of the performance of it. That was still true. What she was, she now admitted, standing at the edge of the thing she had been circling for 3 months, was not afraid. She was awake. Fully, carefully, uncomplicatedly awake. In the way that you are awake when something is actually happening, not something you have been waiting for, or hoping for, or calculating toward, but something that is simply, honestly, genuinely real. That was new. That was, she thought, the thing she had been missing, without knowing she was missing it. She pushed back from the table, and went to write to Judge Alcott about the Criminal Law Amendment Bill, because life continued in all its practical details, even when the extraordinary thing was happening alongside it, and she was the kind of person who wrote her letters first, and thought about the extraordinary thing after. But she was smiling when she wrote, which the judge, who had known her since she was 11 years old, and had been writing him letters ever since, would notice, and would ask about, and to whom she would have to decide what, if anything, to say. She would think about that later. Right now there was the letter, and the May morning, and Chatsworth in 8 days. And a kitchen garden she had, she realized, been looking forward to seeing since the first time a large, gray-eyed, entirely unexpected man had mentioned it at a supper table, 6 weeks ago. with something that looked very much like hope. Meanwhile, on the other side of London, William Cavendish was having a conversation with his cousin that he had not wanted to have, and had known, for approximately 3 weeks, was unavoidable. Hart had arrived at the Piccadilly house uninvited at 11 in the morning, which was precisely the kind of thing that Hart did, and which William had long since stopped being surprised by. He was shown into the study, where William was working through correspondence, and he sat down in the chair opposite the desk and said, "She's coming to Chatsworth." "The Howards have accepted," William said, without looking up from his papers. "I know. I heard from her father." Hart settled in his chair, with the ease of a man who is entirely comfortable wherever he finds himself. "I also heard from 3 different people at dinner on Friday that London is drawing conclusions." "London draws conclusions about everything," William said. "Yes, but usually London draws conclusions about things that are not actually happening. In this case, London appears to be drawing correct conclusions, which is a different situation." Hart leaned forward slightly. William set down his pen. Hart looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has known a person for 20 years and has the experience to distinguish between the many varieties of that person's silence. "Are you certain about this?" he asked. "No," William said. "I am not certain about anything regarding Miss Howard, except that I am entirely incapable of not seeking out her company, which is a state of affairs I have not been in since I was 26 years old." Hart was quiet for a moment. "She's 30 years younger than you, 29. That is not a significant improvement." "No," William agreed. "It isn't." He looked at the wall for a moment. "I am aware of the disparity. I am aware of what it means for her life as opposed to mine. I am aware that I am asking her to step into a world that will require considerable things of her, and that she may find, after the novelty of attention has passed, that the requirement is more than she wished to take on." He paused. "I told her as much. In April, when I called, she informed me, very directly, that she was capable of deciding for herself what she could and could not take on." "Yes," Hart said. "She would say that." "She also told me she was not good at being a duchess," William said. "In exactly those words." Hart stared at him for a moment. Then, very slowly, he started to smile. "And what did you say?" "Nothing useful," William said. "I was thinking about Eleanor." Hart's smile softened. "Eleanor would have liked her." "Yes," William said. "I believe she would have." They sat for a moment in the comfortable silence of people who have known each other long enough to have shared a great deal, including loss, and who do not feel the need to perform anything in the presence of that knowledge. "She argued with 3 cabinet ministers at the Pembrokes," Hart said, "over the course of one dinner. Did you know that? 2 before I arrived, 1 after." "I did not know it was 3, William said. "One of them agreed with her," Hart said. "By the end, he sent her father a note the following week about a committee he thought she should be aware of. Her father had to explain that she was a woman, and therefore not in a position to serve on a committee." He paused. The minister apparently said he knew that, which was the entire problem. William looked at his desk for a moment. "She is going to make things very interesting," he said, and the word interesting had a quality in his voice that Hart had not heard from him in a very long time. Something close to anticipation. Something almost warm. "Yes," Hart said, "she is." He stood, smoothing his coat with the brisk air of a man who has accomplished his purpose. "I came to tell you that I think you should be certain, and I now believe you are, so I'll leave you to your correspondence." He paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I crossed the room at the Pembrokes' dinner specifically to introduce you to her. I thought she would do you good." "She is doing me considerable disruption," William said. "Same thing," Hart said, and left. William sat in his study for a long time after that, looking at the papers on his desk and not seeing them. He was thinking about something Blanche Howard had said on the first walk, on the path in the park when the new leaves were in the trees, and the morning light was the clean, unguarded kind. He had told her about not feeling things, about the discipline of it, and she had said, "That sounds exhausting," with the simple directness of someone who was naming a thing clearly because she thought it deserved a clear name. She had not been unkind. She had not been pitying. She had simply said the true thing, out loud, in the way that she appeared to say most things, as though she had decided at some point that clarity was a form of respect, and she intended to offer it consistently. He thought about what it meant to have someone say the true thing to you. He thought about how long it had been. He picked up his pen and went back to his correspondence, and the morning continued, and somewhere across London, Blanche Howard was writing a letter to a retired judge and smiling without quite knowing she was doing it, and the May light was the same light over both of them, indifferent and warm in equal measure, doing what spring light does, insisting, without drama, that things grow. Chatsworth was the kind of place that asks something of you the moment you saw it. The carriage turned through the park gates at 4 in the afternoon, on the second Thursday of June, and Blanche Howard saw the house for the first time, across a wide sweep of pale gravel and dark green lawn, and she sat up very straight, without quite meaning to. It was enormous. She had known it would be enormous. Everyone said it was enormous. But the word enormous, it turned out, was a category error. Enormous suggested scale. Chatsworth suggested something closer to geography. It rose from the Derbyshire landscape, with the calm, absolute confidence of something that had been there long enough to stop worrying about it. There, her mother said, with a complicated expression. Her father said nothing, which was his mode of expressing very strong feelings. Blanche sat in the carriage and looked at the house coming toward them and thought, very honestly, about what it would mean to be the mistress of it, to walk its 175 rooms, to receive its guests in its formal rooms, to be, in every public way, the person that house required. She felt, briefly, the thing she had told the Duke she felt, the weight of it, the performance of it. Then she thought about the kitchen garden, which was hidden somewhere behind all of that stone and grandeur, and did not give a single thought to being grand, because it was busy growing things. The carriage stopped. The Duke was on the steps. He was wearing different clothes than he wore in London. Country clothes, dark coat, no hat, and he had come outdoors in them, rather than waiting for his guests in a formal interior, which she noted. He greeted her parents with the correct formal warmth and turned to Blanche with the specific quality she had come to look for, the undiluted attention, the gray eyes that registered her as though she were the most interesting thing in the landscape. "Miss Howard," he said. "Your Grace," she said, "you have a great deal of house." Something happened in his expression, not quite the laugh she had heard once, on the path in Hyde Park. The structure of it, though. "Everything it needed. It comes with the position," he said. "Does all of it?" she said. "Or just most of it? Come and see the garden tomorrow," he said. "I'll show you what belongs to the position, and what belongs to me." She looked at him in the afternoon light on the Chatsworth steps, with the enormous house behind him, and the Derbyshire sky very high and blue overhead, and she thought that she understood, for the first time, the difference. The house belonged to the position. The kitchen garden belonged to him. The house party was a gathering of approximately 25 people, a combination of family, colleagues, political connections, and the kind of old friends who come when invited, not because of obligation, but because they genuinely like the person doing the inviting. Blanche had expected formality. There was formality, of the correct kind, at the correct times, but Chatsworth in June, it turned out, was a different thing from Chatsworth in principle. The evenings were formal, with the beautiful high-ceilinged dining room, and the crystal, and the careful seating arrangements. The days were something else. People walked, people rode, those who rode. People sat on the terrace, in the long Derbyshire light, and read, or talked, or did nothing very productive, and seemed unashamed of it. The atmosphere of the house was, she found to her genuine surprise, easier to inhabit than she had expected. The Duke moved through it all with a visible easing that she had not seen in him in London. He was quieter here, in the way of someone who is quiet because they are comfortable, rather than quiet because they are defended. He talked to his guests about specific things, the specific qualities of the landscape, the specific history of a particular part of the house, the specific problem with the third field on the north side of the estate that his land manager had identified last autumn. He asked specific questions, and he listened to the specific answers. He had not changed, but London had been a performance for him, in a way that this was not, and the difference was considerable. On Friday morning, he found her at breakfast before the other guests had come down, eating toast and reading the newspaper that had been sent up from the village, and he said, "The garden, if you have time this morning." "I have time," she said, and put the newspaper down. The kitchen garden was through a low stone archway on the north side of the house. The archway itself was unremarkable. Old stone, slightly overgrown with something creeping and green. But it was the kind of unremarkable thing that people walk past every day without registering, and she had a sense, stepping through it, of crossing into a different kind of place. The garden was large. Not Chatsworth large. Not the overwhelming formal scale of the grounds and the house. Large in a human way, a working way. The beds were laid out in a pattern that suggested long thought about what went where and why, and every available space was in use. There were cabbages. There were leeks, still small, and rows of broad beans in their first flowers, white and faintly sweet-smelling. There were apple trees against the south wall, trained flat and precise, their blossoms done now but their small early fruit beginning, the size of large marbles. And in the section nearest the east wall, something different, plants that were not for eating, plants that were simply for being. Lavender in great spilling mounds, roses trained carefully along the wall, a section of something she didn't immediately recognize, that had narrow silver-gray leaves, and would flower, she thought, in late summer. "That's the new section," the Duke said, from beside her. "The one your gardener objects to," she said. "He has come around slightly," William said. "He admits the lavender has a practical application in the herbs section. He will not extend this concession to the roses." She walked to the new section and crouched down beside the lavender, which was not yet in full bloom, but was working toward it in the patient way of lavender, which doesn't rush and doesn't need to. She could smell it from here. It was one of her favorite smells. "She liked lavender?" Blanche asked. "She liked the smell of it on sheets," he said. It was a very specific and unpretentious preference for someone of her position. He paused. Most of her preferences were specific and unpretentious. She would have found this section of the garden very sensible. "And what would she have thought of the rest of it?" Blanche asked. He was quiet for a moment. "She would have found a comprehensive list of improvements and communicated them to the head gardener, without preliminary. He would have been rather put out, and then done every one of them." Blanche looked at the lavender and thought about a woman who said what she meant and did not apologize for it, who wore a great title, like a coat, and took it off when the occasion allowed, who had been married to this man for how long? She didn't know exactly. Long enough to leave a lavender-shaped space in the garden and a quality of absence in the man who had known her, and was still, after 14 years, planting things in her memory. She stood up. "I have been thinking about what you said," she told him, "in London, about being very good at not feeling things." He looked at her. The morning light in the kitchen garden was the clear, unflat kind that comes when the sun is low enough to come in sideways, and it made his gray eyes look, briefly, like something else entirely. "I think," she said, "that it cannot have been as restful as you said." He was quiet. "I think you have been very alone," she said, not with pity, just with the simple, clear honesty that was the only way she knew how to say true things. He stood very still for a moment, then he said, in a voice that was very even and very careful, "Yes." The garden was quiet around them. The bees were beginning their morning work in the lavender, slow and purposeful. Somewhere beyond the archway, a gardener was pushing a wheelbarrow along the gravel path, with the characteristic sound of someone doing a thing they have done 1,000 times and expect to do 1,000 times more. "I am not asking you anything right now," Blanche said. "I don't have a question to ask. I just wanted to say that I think aloneness of that kind is not a dignified choice. I think it is something that happens to people when they have been hurt, and the hurt was large enough that they decided the only safe response was to stop." She looked at him. "And I think you are allowed to stop stopping." He looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. She was not. She had established long ago, someone who looked away from things. "Yes," he said, at last, very quietly. "I think I am beginning to understand that." She nodded, once, and then turned and looked back at the lavender, and he stood beside her, and they were both quiet, and the bees went about their business, and the June morning opened around them with the particular patience of things that have been growing steadily, unhurried and purposeful, in the direction of something they have always known was there. It was not a declaration. It was not a grand scene. It was something truer than either of those things. Two people standing in a garden, having said something real, in the presence of lavender and apple trees, and 14 years of careful grief, and the slow, difficult, entirely specific work of learning to be present in your own life again. It was enough. For now, it was exactly enough. On the third evening at Chatsworth, after the formal dinner had wound to its close, and the guests had dispersed into their separate arrangements, some to the card room, some to the library, some to their own rooms, Blanche Howard found herself sitting beside the Countess of Derby on the window seat of the long gallery that ran along the east side of the house. The Countess of Derby was a woman of 60 with the energy of someone half her age and the particular social intelligence of someone who had spent 40 years paying close attention to how people actually behaved, as opposed to how they said they did. She had been one of the first people in London to be kind to Blanche, which Blanche attributed not to any special quality in herself, but to the fact that the Countess found genuine curiosity more interesting than careful performance, and Blanche was, she knew, constitutionally incapable of the latter. "He watches you," the Countess said, without preamble. Blanche looked out the long window at the dark park. "Does he?" "Not the way men usually watch women. They've decided they want," the Countess said. "Not calculating. Not possessive. He watches you the way someone watches something that reminds them they're alive." She paused. "I haven't seen him do that in 14 years. I'm not sure I ever saw it with Eleanor, actually. Which is not a criticism of Eleanor. It's a different thing." "What is it?" Blanche asked. "Recognition," the Countess said. "He recognizes you. That's what it looks like." She looked out the window beside Blanche. "The question is whether you recognize him." Blanche thought about this for a long time. She thought about the specific quality of being listened to by someone who means it. She thought about gray eyes, and a kitchen garden, and a man who laughed, briefly, once, on a path in Hyde Park, and had looked, for 3 seconds, like someone who had forgotten he was the glacier. "I do," she said. "Then what are you waiting for?" the Countess asked, with the directness of a woman who has earned the right to ask direct questions. "I'm not waiting," Blanche said. "I'm thinking. Those are not always different things." Blanche looked out at the dark beyond the windows. The park was very dark, with just the beginning shapes of the trees visible against a sky that was not quite dark enough to be fully night. That particular deep blue of English summer evenings, that is not darkness but the edge of it. "I'm frightened," she said, and then, more honestly, not of him, of what it costs. "Yes," the Countess said. "The great houses always cost." "Not just the house," Blanche said. "The visibility. The way a woman in that position is reduced to her position. The way her own thoughts become either a scandal or an irrelevance, depending on the day." The Countess was quiet for a moment. Eleanor found a way through it. It was not always easy. But she found it. "I know. He told me." Blanche turned from the window. She hung the coat up when she wasn't required to wear it. "And he let her," the Countess said. "That, I think, is the thing you may be undervaluing. He let her. He didn't ask her to be the coat all the time. He didn't need her to be. He needed her to be herself." She paused. "He needs that from you too. I think that may be why he crossed the room that first night at the Pembrokes. He hadn't seen it in a very long time." Blanche was quiet. Outside, the Derbyshire dark came fully in at last, and the window became a reflection of the room behind them, the gallery, the lamps, the two women on the window seat, and, at the far end of the gallery, visible in the reflection, the Duke of Devonshire, standing in the doorway, as though he had arrived somewhere he had not been entirely sure he would be welcome, and was waiting to see. She looked at his reflection for a moment. Then she turned around. He was, in fact, in the doorway. He had come to find something, the library perhaps. He looked, briefly, like a man who has arrived somewhere and discovered it is more crowded than he anticipated. "Your Grace," the Countess said pleasantly. "Miss Howard and I were just finishing our conversation. Please come in." William came in. The Countess rose, which was the kind of perfectly calibrated exit that only very skilled social navigators could execute with complete invisibility, and was gone. And Blanche was still on the window seat, and William was standing in the gallery, with the lamplight making long shadows behind him, and the room was very quiet. "I wasn't looking for the library," he said. "I know where the library is." I didn't think you were, she said. He came and stood near the window. Not sitting. He was too still for sitting. Tonight. Too much in motion inside himself to be casual about position. I want to say something, he said. Then say it. He looked at her. The gray eyes in the gallery light were not quite the same gray as they were in daylight. Warmer somehow. Or else she was only now learning to see the warmth that had always been there. I am not good at this, he said. I was not especially good at it when I was young, and I have not improved. I don't have the facility for saying things that are felt as well as meant. I can say what I mean precisely. I am less certain I can make you understand what I feel when I mean it. Try, she said. A pause. I have been alone for 14 years, he said. I didn't understand until very recently that I had chosen it. Not because the loneliness was what I wanted, but because wanting anything felt irresponsible. Presumptuous. Eleanor had died, and I thought the appropriate response to that was to stop requiring things of the world. He paused. And then you told me that I was standing in your light, and you were not unkind about it. You were just factual. And something. He stopped. He looked at his hands, the way she had seen him do once before. I have been paying attention to that ever since, he said, without knowing how to say so. William, she said. He looked up. She had not used his name before. She was aware of this, and she thought he was too, because something shifted in his face at the sound of it. I know, she said. I have been paying attention too. The gallery held the quiet around them. The lamps were steady. Outside, the Derbyshire night was complete and full of the particular sounds of a large landscape. The wind in the park trees, somewhere very far away, the low note of an owl. I would like to be permitted to call on you formally, he said, with your parents' knowledge, with your consent, without the ambiguity that has... Yes, she said. I have not yet finished. You had finished, she said. The rest of it was going to be more of the same thing, arranged differently, and the answer is yes. He looked at her for a very long moment. Then, for the second time she had ever witnessed it, he laughed. Not the brief, controlled single breath of before. Something slightly larger. Something with space in it. You are going to be entirely impossible, he said. I told you that in London, she said. In April. On the very first formal call. You told me you would be difficult, he said. Same thing, she said. He sat down, not in a chair. He sat on the window seat beside her, which he had not done, which was not quite the correct thing to do, which meant that he had stopped making decisions on the basis of correctness and was making them on the basis of what he actually wanted, which was, she thought, the most significant thing she had observed him do since she had known him. Tell me about Judge Alcott, he said. She blinked. Beg your pardon? The retired judge in Bath. You've mentioned him 3 times. I would like to know about him. She looked at him. I want to know the things that matter to you, he said, with complete simplicity. Specifically, I don't want a social version of you. I want the actual one. She thought, briefly, of the Countess's word. Recognition. Judge Alcott, she said, has been corresponding with me since I was 11 years old, and I sent him a letter about a court case I had read about in the newspaper, that my father left on the table. He thought my analysis was wrong, which it was, and he told me so, and told me why, and asked what I thought now, and I have been answering that question in various forms ever since. And do you still have his letters? Everyone. Then he has known you longer than anyone outside your family, William said. Yes, she said. He says I am the best argument he knows for the education of women, which he considers a compliment, and I consider merely accurate. Something in William's expression did something warm and specific. I think, he said, that he is entirely right. Outside, the owl called again, its single clear note carrying across the dark, and Blanche Howard sat on the window seat of the long gallery at Chatsworth, and decided, with the honesty she brought to all her decisions, that this was the beginning of something she had not expected to find in a park in April in the rain, talking to a man who moved through rooms like someone who had decided how much space he was allowed, and who had been, for 14 years, magnificently and unnecessarily wrong about that calculation. She was going to tell him so, repeatedly, across the rest of the things that came after this. She looked forward to it. There is a moment, sometimes, in the middle of something that is going quietly right, when the wrong thing enters. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with visible warning. It arrives in the way that most difficult things arrive, through an ordinary door, in an ordinary voice, wearing the particular expression of someone who is about to say something that cannot be unsaid. Blanche was in the morning room at Chatsworth on the 5th day, sitting with Lady Wentworth, who was a gentle woman of about 40, who liked to paint watercolors of the view from the terrace, and had been doing so since Tuesday, with the focused satisfaction of someone pursuing a private pleasure. They were talking about nothing of consequence: the wildflowers in the park, the quality of the light, a novel they had both read with opposite conclusions, when the door opened and Mrs. Dunmore came in. Mrs. Dunmore was the wife of one of the Duke's political colleagues, a woman of 50 with a careful face and the particular social awareness of someone who catalogues information the way others catalog stamps, with complete dedication and no clear understanding of why. She sat down, accepted tea, and said, in the tone of someone who has been waiting for the right moment, "I hope I am not speaking out of turn, Miss Howard. I'm sure it is nothing. But I heard something at dinner last night, not at the table, in the hall, between Lady Cavendish and Lord Alberley, and I don't think I was meant to hear it, that I thought perhaps you should be aware of." Blanche looked at her. "Lady Cavendish," Mrs. Dunmore said, "is the Duke's eldest daughter, as you know. She has apparently been expressing concern about the nature of the Duke's relationship with you, and Lord Alberley, who is her husband's uncle, was saying, 'I am sorry, Miss Howard, this is very awkward, that Lady Cavendish has been telling people in London that she believes her father is being foolish, that a woman of your background cannot possibly be appropriate, that the Duke is not thinking clearly.'" She paused. "I am sorry. I thought it better you knew." Lady Wentworth made a small, distressed sound. Blanche looked at her teacup. She took a breath, very slowly, and let it out. She thought about Lady Cavendish, Eleanor Cavendish, who had become Eleanor Stanhope when she married, a woman of 30, who had grown up in a house with a father who had shut himself down entirely, and was now watching that father be quietly opened by someone her family's background would not have chosen. She thought about what that must look like from the inside, what it must cost. She did not take it personally. She took it as information. She set down her teacup and said, quite evenly, "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Dunmore. I appreciate your kindness." And she excused herself and walked through the house, not quickly, not visibly troubled, through the main corridor and the east passage, and out through the low archway that led to the kitchen garden. Because if she was going to think about this, she was going to think about it somewhere that was honest. The kitchen garden in the afternoon was full of the warm, complicated smell of growing things in summer, earth and green, and the particular sweetness of the broad beans, which were in full flower now. She walked to the new section with the lavender, and she stood there for a while, not doing anything, just standing, looking at the roses that were beginning to open along the east wall. She heard him before she saw him. He came through the archway with the walk she had come to know, measured, deliberate, fully present. He had been told, or he had noticed her absence. Either way, he came. "I heard about Mrs. Dunmore's conversation," he said. "I assumed you would," she said. "How is Lady Cavendish?" He was quiet for a moment. "Afraid," he said. "I think. She loved her mother very much. She finds the idea of someone in Eleanor's place difficult." "That is entirely understandable," Blanche said. "Yes," he said. "And you?" she said. "What do you find?" He came and stood beside her. He looked at the roses, which were doing what roses do in June, opening, carefully, petal by careful petal, without hurrying. "I find," he said, "that I have been very patient with myself for a very long time. Patient, in the way of letting 14 years of nothing pass, and calling it appropriate management of grief." He paused. Eleanor would have called it something less generous. What would she have called it? "A failure of courage," he said, without self-pity, dressed up as discipline. Blanche was quiet for a moment. "Your daughter loves you," she said. "She is afraid of what this means for what she remembers. That's not something that requires anyone to be wrong." "No," he said, "you are right. I am not going to disappear because she is afraid," Blanche said. "But I am not going to require her to accept me before she is ready, either." These things take time. They take everyone being honest about what they feel, rather than performing what they think they should feel. She looked at him. Can you speak to her? I intend to, he said. Tomorrow. I will ask her to come to Chatsworth at the end of the week. Good, she said. He turned and looked at her fully, and she looked back, and the afternoon was very warm, and the roses were opening, and the bees were deep in the lavender, entirely committed to their own purposes. You are not distressed, he said. It was not quite a question. I am a little distressed, she said honestly. I don't like being spoken of as though my background is a problem. I am not a problem. I am a perfectly capable person, with a perfectly capable mind, and a great deal of character, and my father does not have a title, and I do not have a fortune, and none of that changes what I am. She paused. But I am not going to let it become an obstacle between us, unless you let it become one. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, the kind that took up space, the kind she had noticed first at the Pembrokes' dinner, and had been trying, without great success, not to think about since. It will not, he said. No, she agreed, it won't. They stood in the kitchen garden in the Derbyshire afternoon, and the bees went on with their work, and the roses opened another fraction, and something that had been held carefully and quietly in the space between them settled, with the unhurried certainty of something that has known where it was going all along. That evening at dinner, Blanche sat at the table in the beautiful formal room, and ate well, and talked to her neighbors on both sides, and did not perform anything that she did not mean. And at the end of the table she caught, once, the grey eyes of the Duke of Devonshire. He looked at her with the recognition. She looked back with her own. And the dinner went on, and the evening went on, and Chatsworth was enormous, and beautiful, and full of its own particular history, and she was in it, and she was not, as she had feared she might be, lost. She was exactly where she was, which turned out to be exactly where she needed to be. The following morning, William rose before most of his guests and went, as he almost always did at Chatsworth, to the kitchen garden in the early light. He had slept badly, which was not unusual for him in the middle of complicated things, and he had woken at 5 with the particular clarity of a sleepless early morning, and lain in the dark, thinking about his daughter. Eleanor Stanhope had always had her mother's directness, which was both the quality he admired most in her, and the quality that made conversations with her most demanding. She said what she meant. She did not hide in implication or suggestion. When she was unhappy, she said so, and when she was afraid, she also said so, and both of those things cost her something, and she paid the cost without complaint, which was, he understood, something she had learned from watching him not do it for the better part of her childhood. He acknowledged in the early morning quiet of the kitchen garden, not the most accessible father. He had been present. He had been responsible. He had attended the events that required attending, and made the decisions that required making, and been there, in the physical sense, for most of the things that mattered. But accessible was different from present, and he had not been accessible. He had been, as Blanche Howard had said with her terrible and entirely accurate directness, very alone. And people who are very alone build walls around that aloneness, not to keep others out, but to keep themselves from having to be anything other than alone, which is a different and more complicated motivation. His children had grown up against those walls. They had not been hurt by them, not in any active sense, but they had learned to move around them, the way people learn to move around permanent obstacles in a familiar space, without drama, without complaint, adjusting naturally to what they understood the landscape to require. Eleanor Stanhope had been adjusting to the landscape of her father for 30 years. The landscape was changing. She had not been told it was going to change. She was managing this, he understood, with the best tools available to her, which included a considerable amount of fear and a perhaps insufficient amount of information. He sent a note to her London address that morning, before the rest of the house was fully awake, asking her to come to Chatsworth before the end of the week if she was able. She arrived on Saturday afternoon with her husband, a quiet, decent man named Philip Stanhope, who had the excellent quality of understanding when to be invisible, which he demonstrated immediately by discovering an urgent need to examine the stables with Lord Pembroke, and leaving his wife to walk with her father. They walked in the formal gardens, which were the Duke's least favorite part of Chatsworth, but which were public and open, and had the quality of space that difficult conversations require. Room to move away from a thing and return to it without the pressure of walls and furniture, making the distance feel calculated. Eleanor Stanhope was her mother's daughter in the quality of her silence. She did not fill it with noise. She walked beside her father and let the silence be what it was for a while, and he let it be what it was, and eventually she said, "I heard what Mrs. Dunmore told Miss Howard." "I know," he said. "I am not sorry for what I said," she said. "I want you to know that. I said what I believe." "I know that too," he said. "I believe that she is too young and too different from your world, and that you are making a decision that seems right to you now, but that you may find is more complicated than you expect." She walked beside him, without looking at him, her gaze on the formal gardens, the ordered hedges, the gravel paths laid out in straight, precise lines. "I believe these things because I am your daughter, and because I have watched you be alone for 14 years, and I am afraid that in the middle of that aloneness, you have met someone who feels like an answer, and I don't know if she is the answer, or just the feeling of one." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a very clear statement of a very difficult concern," he said. "And you deserve a clear answer." "Please," she said. "She is not an answer in the sense of something that solves a problem," he said. "She is a person, a specific person who thinks in specific ways and says true things, and does not require me to be the glacier in her presence, which is the only requirement I have needed from anyone for a very long time." He paused. "I am not in the middle of aloneness, Eleanor. I have been in it. I think I am, finally, at the edge of it. And she did not put me at the edge. I arrived there because 14 years are long enough." He looked at his daughter. "She is simply the person who was at the edge when I got there, standing in her own light, not looking at me, not requiring anything of me, just there." Eleanor Stanhope walked beside her father in the formal gardens of Chatsworth, and did not speak for a long time. "She seems very direct," she said, at last. "She is entirely direct," he said. "It is, in my experience, one of her most consistent qualities." "That can be tiring," Eleanor said. "I find it the opposite," he said. She looked at him then, sidelong, with her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of looking at things straight without flinching. "You look different," she said. "Different how?" "Less like stone," she said. "Or, still like stone. But stone that has begun to remember it was not always stone." She looked away again. "I want to meet her properly, not in a drawing room full of people. Actually properly." "Yes," he said, "I thought you might." He arranged it the following morning. A walk in the kitchen garden, 3 people, the kind of ordinary and unperformative thing that allowed people to become acquainted without the pressure of a declared significance. His daughter and Blanche had talked about the lavender, about the smell of lavender on linen, which Eleanor remembered clearly from her childhood, in a way that connected directly to something Blanche said about the specific sensory quality of domestic comfort. And they had talked about it for 20 minutes, with the ease of 2 people who have found, unexpectedly, common ground. William had stood slightly back and watched. Eleanor had looked at Blanche Howard with the beginning of recognition. It was not complete. It would take time. These things took time. But it was a beginning. And in the economy of 14 years of stone, a beginning was a considerable thing. On the last evening of the Chatsworth gathering, when most of the guests had said their farewells and the house was settling into its quieter mode, William Cavendish walked through the east wing to the small study he used when he was at Chatsworth, not the grand library, which was for guests and formal occasions, but the smaller room, with the low shelves and the particular chair that had been reupholstered twice, and was in need of a third reupholstering that he had not got around to arranging. He sat in the chair and held a book he did not read, and thought. He thought about what he had said to his daughter. "I am at the edge of it." He had not understood, until he said it, that this was the right way to describe where he was. Not beginning, not starting again, which implied a kind of erasure he did not want and would not accept. At the edge, having traveled the interior of aloneness for so long that he had finally arrived at its outer limits, where the light was different, where things were visible that had not been visible from the center. He thought about Blanche Howard saying, in the kitchen garden in the June afternoon, with complete directness and no decoration, I am not a problem. She was not. She was, he thought, in the private dark of the small study, with the reupholstered chair. The most specific and surprising thing that had come to him in a very long time. Not the easiest thing. Not a comfortable thing, in the sense of comfort as softness and accommodation. But the real kind of comfort. The kind that comes from being with someone who tells you the true thing, and then stands there while you decide what to do with it. He opened the book. He closed the book. He went to the writing desk and found a piece of paper, and wrote, in his careful, economical hand, a short letter to his solicitor in London, asking him to prepare the formal paperwork relevant to a proposed settlement, which was the first step of the correct procedure, and which he was taking, because the correct procedure had its uses, and he had no intention of doing this incorrectly. Then he wrote a letter to Sir Edmund Howard. Then he sat back and looked at what he had written and thought about a woman who read books she had borrowed from her father without returning them and argued about eligibility criteria and said, "You have been very alone, without pity," as a simple true fact, and thought about her notebook at the botanical lecture and the small private smile and the 3 seconds on a park path when he had laughed and she had covered the answering smile on her face by looking at the ground. She had not hidden it entirely. He had seen it. He had been seeing it ever since, carrying it around, a small and very specific thing, in the pocket of an interior he had believed was entirely closed. He sealed the letters and set them for the morning post. Then he went to bed and lay in the dark of the master bedroom at Chatsworth, with the long windows open onto the June night. And he thought about the word continuing, and the word had a specific texture to it, not the smooth, frictionless texture of a plan executed correctly, but the rougher, more honest texture of a real thing. A real thing, with all the complication and cost that real things carry. He found, to his considerable surprise, that he did not mind the cost. He found that the cost felt, for the first time in 14 years, like something worth paying. The June dark was warm, and the park was alive with its own night sounds, and William Cavendish, 7th Duke of Devonshire, lay in the dark, and was, for the first time he could remember in a very long time, not alone in any way that mattered. Even in the quiet, even in the space of the room, he was not alone. That was new. That was, he thought, the point. What happened next was this. The Morning Post went out with 2 letters. The solicitor received his instructions and began, with professional efficiency, the process of drawing up the relevant documents. Sir Edmund Howard received his letter at 11 in the morning, read it twice, set it down on his desk, and sat for a very long time looking at the wall before going to find his wife. Margaret Howard read the letter without expression. Then she went to find her daughter. Blanche was at her desk in the sitting room, writing the letter to Judge Alcott that she had begun composing in her head during the last 3 days of the house party. She was on her second draft. The first draft had contained several references to the Duke of Devonshire that she had decided, on reflection, were more revealing than she intended, and she had started again with more restraint. She was mid-sentence when her mother came in. "Your father has received a letter," Margaret Howard said. Blanche put down her pen. She looked at her mother. Margaret Howard was a woman who, in 23 years, had expressed excitement approximately 4 times that Blanche could count, and on 2 of those occasions, it had been about the garden. She was not typically a woman whose face showed everything she felt. Today, her face showed everything she felt. "I see," Blanche said. "He has asked your father's permission," her mother said, formally, in the correct way, with the complete settlement details, and the wording one uses in these matters, and at the end of it, she stopped. She appeared to be exercising considerable self-control. "At the end of it, he has written a paragraph about what kind of woman you are, and it is—" She stopped again. "What?" Blanche said. Her mother sat down, which was something Margaret Howard rarely did in the middle of conveying information, being more of a standing and pacing person. She sat down in the chair beside the desk and looked at her daughter and said, "He says you have made it impossible for him to find his previous arrangements satisfactory. He says this is entirely your fault. He says he is grateful for it." The room was very quiet. "Your father," her mother said, "has replied." Blanche looked at her desk. "Already?" "Your father has been waiting for this letter for approximately 4 months, Margaret Howard said, with the precise tone of a woman who has been managing her husband's patience and her own with equal effort. "He replied within the hour." Blanche sat with this information for a moment. "He wants your decision from you directly," her mother said. "The Duke, your father says he was very clear about that the formal permission was a matter of protocol, but that the actual answer had to come from you." Blanche looked out the window of the sitting room, at the small London garden behind the house. The June afternoon was warm and clear, and the old roses against the back wall were in bloom, which they were for about 3 weeks each year, and which she had always considered one of the more reliable pleasures of the calendar. She thought about everything she had been thinking about since March. She thought about what it cost. She thought about what it was worth. She thought about a man sitting on the window seat of a gallery at Chatsworth, asking her about a retired judge in Bath, because he wanted to know the things that mattered to her specifically, not a social version of her, the actual one. She picked up her pen. She wrote her reply to the Duke of Devonshire, which was not long, because she had never needed many words for things she meant. It said, "I know, and yes, and I reserve the right to call you tedious when you are being tedious, which you agreed to. And if you are going to stand in my light permanently, I suggest you get used to the fact that I will not dim it for the sake of the room." She sent it before she could reconsider, which was her general approach to decisions she had already made in the part of herself that made decisions before the rest of her caught up. Then she went back to the letter to Judge Alcott and began the third draft, which did not restrain itself at all. She wrote that she had something to tell him. She wrote that she was going to be married, which was a sentence that looked strange on paper, but true, in a way that most strange sentences were not. She wrote that she was going to marry a man who listened as though he meant it, which she had told him before was what she wanted, and that she had found it in an unexpected direction and at a higher elevation than she had anticipated. She wrote, because Judge Alcott had known her since she was 11, and would not be satisfied with less. He is 54, and I am 23, and the gap is considerable, and the world will have opinions about it, and I find that I care about the world's opinions approximately as much as I have always cared about them, which is to say, I am aware of them, and largely unmoved by them. He thinks clearly. He acts carefully. He has been alone for a very long time, and has decided, in the middle of it, to stop, and I respect that decision very much. I also find, which I did not expect, that I am glad to be the person standing there when he stopped. She sealed the letter and addressed it. Then she went to her window and watched the June afternoon do its unhurried work on the garden below, and thought about what came next with the specific, grounded anticipation of someone who has made a decision they intended to keep. She was not afraid. She was, she thought, precisely what she had told him she was. Not good at being a duchess, but very good at being herself. And herself, it turned out, was what he wanted. That was, she had decided, the entire story, and the most important part of it, and the part she intended to remember on the days when the house was large, and the position was heavy, and the coat was required. The actual one. Not the performance. The actual one. That was what he had asked for. That was what she would give. Without compromise, without apology, without dimming the light for the sake of the room. The letter arrived at the Duke's Piccadilly house on a Tuesday morning. Perkins brought it to William at breakfast, on the silver tray he used for personal correspondence, and William looked at the handwriting on the envelope for a moment before opening it. He had learned, in the 3 months of knowing her, to recognize the particular quality of Blanche Howard's handwriting, direct, clear, unhurried, exactly like her voice. He read the letter. He read it again. He set it down beside his coffee cup and looked at it for a long time, and something in his chest did the thing it had been doing since March, in slightly larger increments. Not the shift anymore. Not the small tremor of something remembering it wasn't stone, but something more like the sound that stone makes when it finally, actually breaks. Not violently, quietly, the way very old stone breaks, with the quality of something that has been waiting a very long time for the pressure to exceed its resistance, and has finally permitted it. He picked up the letter and read it a third time. She had said yes in the first word. She had negotiated terms in the second and third sentences, which was so entirely like her that he found himself, for the third time since he had known her, on the edge of the thing that had come twice before. The brief, real, unguarded laugh, the one that lived in the structure of his face, and had been looking for a reason to happen more often. He folded the letter. He told Perkins to arrange a call on the Howard household for Thursday, which was the earliest reasonable propriety allowed. Then he went to his desk and sat for a while, not working, which was unusual for him. He was almost always working, had been almost always working for the better part of 30 years, had found in work the same thing he had found in the careful management of his interior, a way to occupy all the available space so that nothing difficult could get in. He was not working. He was sitting at his desk in the morning light of his London house and being, quite simply and without particular productivity, content. It was a strange and unfamiliar state. He observed it with the same careful attention he brought to things he did not immediately understand. He was not certain how long it would last, or whether it was a reliable condition, or simply the temporary effect of receiving good news on a Tuesday morning in June. He thought it might be reliable. He thought that things Blanche Howard produced, responses, reactions, states of feeling, tended to be reliable, because she herself was reliable, in the specific sense of being consistently what she actually was, rather than what the occasion suggested she should be. He wrote to Judge Alcott. He had not intended to, and the impulse surprised him when it arrived, but he sat at the desk and wrote a short letter to the judge in Bath, introducing himself, and noting that he understood the judge and Miss Howard had been in correspondence since she was 11 years old, and that he would consider it an honor to meet him when the opportunity arose, and that anyone who had been reading her letters since she was 11 had access to a version of her that he himself had only begun to discover, and he expected that access was considerable. He was not entirely sure why he wrote the letter. He thought it had something to do with the specific quality of a man who had told a young girl that her analysis was wrong, and then asked her what she thought now, and had been getting answers ever since for 12 years. That was, he thought, a particular kind of trust, the kind that says you are worth the honest answer, and keeps saying it, and builds, over years of letters, something that has the weight and texture of actual knowledge. He wanted that kind of knowledge. He was beginning, carefully and without rushing, to accumulate it. He sent the letter. Then he went back to his estate accounts, because the accounts were still there regardless of what else was happening, and the barley yield was still a matter of concern regardless of whether he was content or not content, and the water rights dispute on the western edge of the Chatsworth grounds had not resolved itself in the interim, and a man who had 30,000 acres of responsibility did not put that responsibility down simply because someone had said yes on a Tuesday morning. He put it down for one more hour, though, just one more hour, to sit at the desk and look at the June light through the Piccadilly window, and be, without particular purpose or productivity, the man who had crossed the room in March, and found, on the other side of the crossing, that the world was considerably warmer than he had remembered. Across London, in Portman Square, the Howard household had entered a state of controlled celebration. Margaret Howard had been planning her daughter's wedding since approximately the middle of April, when she had understood, from the specific quality of Blanche's descriptions of her park walks, that the situation was considerably more advanced than her daughter was prepared to admit. She had not said anything. She had waited, with the patience of a woman who knew her daughter, and knew that Blanche would arrive at her own conclusions in her own time, and that pressing the matter would only produce the particular expression of mild affront that Blanche deployed when she felt her interior processes were being observed. She had waited. She had now been rewarded for the waiting with the entirety of what she had been patient for, and she was managing her response with the discipline of someone who understood that visible triumph in the presence of her daughter would be counterproductive. She managed it very well, all things considered, for the first 3 hours. Then Cecily Vane arrived, having received a letter from Blanche that morning, containing the news in 3 sentences, and the observation that Cecily was, almost certainly, already composing an excessively long reply, and should know that the excessively long reply was welcome, and the 2 women spent 2 hours in the sitting room that Blanche had to vacate, on account of the noise level exceeding what she could comfortably write Judge Alcott's 3rd draft through. Sir Edmund Howard was in his study, which was where he went when the rest of the house was operating. At frequencies he found physiologically challenging. He was reading a paper on drainage systems by a civil engineer of his acquaintance, which was not a subject that most people found compelling, but which Sir Edmund found restful for exactly that reason. He had received the Duke's letter that morning. He had replied, He had then gone to his study and read about drainage systems for 2 hours, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has watched his daughter be underestimated by the world for 23 years, and has now watched the world produce, from somewhere, a man who was not doing that, and found the whole sequence both entirely deserved and mildly miraculous. He would not say any of this to anyone. He would say, when asked, that the match seemed sensible, that the Duke appeared to be a responsible man, that the settlement was generous and the terms fair. He would not say, she was 11 years old when she wrote her first letter to Henry Alcott about a court case, and said, in the last paragraph, that she thought the judge had been wrong and wanted to know if Henry thought so too. And Henry had written back with 3 pages of legal analysis and a line at the end saying that she was right, and he had never seen her look so entirely, purely satisfied by anything in her life before or since, and he had thought then that she was going to need a very specific kind of life, and had worried, in the intervening years, that the specific kind of life she needed was not a kind the world was prepared to offer her. He would not say that. He would read about drainage systems and be grateful, in the quiet way of fathers who love their daughters more than they know how to say, that the world had, at last, produced what she needed. And in Bath, Judge Henry Alcott received 2 letters on the same morning, one from Blanche, 3 sentences, and an invitation to say everything he thought about it, and one from a Duke of Devonshire he had never met, introducing himself with the specific and unexpectedly human observation that anyone who had been reading her letters since she was 11 had access to a version of her that he himself had only begun to discover, and that he expected that access was considerable. Judge Alcott read both letters twice. Then he put them down on the desk of his study in Bath, beside the window that overlooked the garden his wife had planted 20 years ago, and which he maintained now, after her death, as an act of private honor, and he looked out at the garden for a while. He wrote back to Blanche first. He wrote 4 pages, which was restrained for him, covering his thoughts on the match, his assessment of the Duke based on public record, and the evidence of the letter, and his opinion that she had been right about the direction she was going, since she was approximately 17, when she had written to him about a case concerning a woman's right to hold property, and had said, at the end, that she intended to live in a way that did not require her to be less than she was, in order to be acceptable. He wrote, at the end, he wrote to me. That is, I think, the thing you should notice. Not that he wrote, men in his position write many letters, but what he said. He said he expected my access to you to be considerable. A man who knows you have been known elsewhere, and values it, and wants to know what has been known, that is a different kind of man. I look forward to meeting him. I suspect I am going to find him rather better than I expected, and I expect him to be rather good. Then he wrote to the Duke. He wrote 3 pages, which was very restrained for him, and he covered his own knowledge of Blanche from the age of 11. Several of the things he admired most about her, several of the things that would require careful handling, and one thing he thought the Duke should know that nobody else was going to tell him, which was that she had been afraid, for a long time, that the life she wanted was not available to her, and that she had managed that fear with a combination of intellectual busyness and the careful limiting of what she allowed herself to hope for, and that if the Duke understood this and accommodated it, not in the sense of managing her, but in the sense of being the kind of person in whose presence she could gradually stop limiting, then he thought the match would be, in the only terms that actually mattered, genuinely successful. He sealed both letters and gave them to the Morning Post. Then he went back to his garden, because it was June in Bath, and the roses needed attention, and the world continued its ordinary work alongside the extraordinary thing, as it always did, as it always will. He called on Thursday. He arrived at Portman Square at 10:30, with the air of a man who had made a decision and was not going to alter it regardless of whatever the next hour produced, which was the same air he had brought to every significant thing in his life, since he was approximately 30, and had understood that the quality of his decisions depended on his ability to make them without flinching. The difference was that on this particular Thursday, the thing he was not flinching from was not a duty or an obligation or a loss. It was something he wanted. That distinction, he was finding, changed the texture of the not flinching considerably. He was shown into the drawing room. Blanche came in alone, which meant her mother had made a discreet and well-timed domestic decision somewhere in the house, and she sat down across from him with the direct, unguarded quality that he had come to understand was her default mode. No managed distance, no performance, just her, as she actually was, which was exactly what Judge Alcott had meant when he said, access. You wrote to the judge, she said. Yes, he said. He wrote back, she said. 4 pages. He wrote to me as well, William said. 3 pages. He likes you, she said, which had the quality of something she was reporting as a fact she had not entirely anticipated. He is not easy to impress, and he likes you. I found his letter very informative, William said. She looked at him. About what? About you, he said. At 11. At 17. The various stages of a person who has been busy understanding the world and deciding what she intends to do about it. He paused. He says you have been afraid, for a long time, that the life you wanted was not available. She was very still. He told you that, she said. He did. She looked at her hands, which was the first time he had ever seen her look away from him first, just for a moment. Then she looked back. He should not have told you that. I disagree, William said. I think it was the most useful thing I have been told since March. Useful how? She said, and her voice had the quality of someone asking a genuine question from inside a genuine uncertainty, which was a texture he had not heard from her before. Useful in the way that true things are useful, he said. I have been, for 14 years, a man who did not allow himself to hope for much. You have been, for some portion of your life, a woman who was afraid to hope for what she actually wanted. I think those are the same landscape, approached from different directions. He looked at her. I am not going to manage your hopes, Blanche. I am going to try to be a person in whose company you do not need to limit them. That is what I intend. I cannot guarantee I will always succeed, but that is the intention. She looked at him for a long time. Outside the drawing room window, the June street was doing its ordinary business. Carriages, footsteps, the call of a vendor 2 streets over, the city entirely indifferent to what was happening inside one particular house. He also said, William continued, that you argued, when you were 17, that you intended to live in a way that did not require you to be less than you are in order to be acceptable. I remember writing that, she said. I would like to tell you, he said, with the careful and deliberate quality he brought to things that mattered, that I find you entirely acceptable exactly as you are, not manageable, not diminished, acceptable, in the original sense of the word, acceptable meaning received, welcomed, taken in, exactly as presented. He paused. I am aware that I am 54 years old, and have been called a glacier by every drawing room in London for a decade, and that my capacity to make this statement with any air of credibility is limited. But it is the true statement, and I have found, since March, that true statements are generally better than credible ones. Blanche Howard sat across from him in the drawing room of her family's house in Portman Square on a Thursday morning in June, and thought about 17 years old, and a letter she had written to a judge in Bath about property rights, and a sentence at the end that had contained more of her actual self than most of what she had said in public in the years between. She thought about what it meant to say a true thing out loud and have it received. She thought about what he had just said, and the careful, real, precise way he had said it, and the fact that he had written to the judge, and the fact that the judge liked him, and the fact that he had been, for 14 years, a glacier, and was now in her drawing room, saying things about the original meaning of the word acceptable, as though he had been thinking about it for a while. He had been thinking about it for a while. She thought about that. You are, she said, still occasionally going to be tedious. Undoubtedly, he said. About drainage systems, she said. My father has briefed me. He says it runs in the peerage. Something in William's expression did the thing she loved best. The structure of a laugh, the machinery of it, the full warm preparation of it, arriving a half-second before the thing itself. I have several very strong opinions about drainage systems, he said. I know, she said. I have been told. Are you going to reconsider? He said. No, she said. I have decided I can endure drainage systems. That is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, he said. She laughed. The real one, not the small private smile, but the actual laugh, the one that she did not manage or contain, the one that came when something was genuinely and unexpectedly funny. She laughed, and he was looking at her while she did it, and she let him. And the morning light was in the room, and outside the London street was doing its ordinary things, and inside the drawing room, something that had been growing steadily since March, reached whatever it had been growing toward, and simply, quietly, arrived. "I have a condition," she said, when she could. "Only one?" he said. "This one is non-negotiable," she said. "When it is required of me, I will be the Duchess of Devonshire. I will attend the things that require attending, and I will receive the people who require receiving, and I will be, in all the public ways, what the position requires. But when it is not required, the coat goes on the hook," he said. She looked at him. "Eleanor's phrase," he said. "She was right about it. You are right about it." He paused. "The kitchen garden does not care what your title is, nor does Judge Alcott, nor, I think, does the botanist from the Royal Society. These seem to me to be the important constituencies." "You have been thinking about this," she said. "Since April," he said. "Since the morning room in April, when you told me you were not good at being a duchess. I have been thinking about what it would mean to offer you something different from the position. Something alongside the position." He looked at her steadily. "I cannot take the house away. I cannot make the title smaller or the public requirements fewer. But I can ensure, in every way within my ability, that the coat goes on the hook when you are done with it. That is a thing I can actually do." She was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said, eventually. "Yes, the condition is acceptable," he said. Or, "Yes to something larger." "Both," she said. "At the same time. As it appears, they are the same thing." He stood, and she stood, and he crossed the room to where she was standing, and he took her hand, and it was not quite the formal, correct hand-holding of previous occasions. It was different. It was deliberate. It was the gesture of a man who had decided to hold something, and was holding it, actually, and without the intermediary of propriety, and the warmth of it was very real. "Thursday the 14th, she said. "Beg your pardon?" he said. "You should know," she said, "that I am particularly useless on the 14th of any month. I have been writing a letter to an agricultural reform committee every 14th of the month since February, and I am not going to stop, and it makes me irritable in the morning, and preoccupied in the afternoon." He looked at her. "I am giving you accurate information about what you are acquiring," she said. "I appreciate the thoroughness," he said. "There is more," she said. "I will get to it in subsequent conversations." "I look forward to it," he said. And he meant it. Which was, she thought, the most important thing about him. That he meant things. That the space between what he said and what he felt had been closing steadily since March, and was now, she thought, negligible. Almost gone. Not because he had changed, but because he had, very slowly, and at considerable personal cost, allowed himself to be known. She looked at him in the morning room of her parents' house, and felt the specific weight of something real. Not light, not easy, not uncomplicated, but real, which was always what she had wanted, when she said she did not want to be noticed, only known. This was known. This was entirely, specifically, honestly known. The morning continued around them, and the city went on outside, and her mother was somewhere in the house, making a strategic decision about whether to appear immediately or give it another 10 minutes. And Sir Edmund Howard was almost certainly in his study with the drainage paper, aware of what was happening 2 rooms away, and processing it in his quiet and private manner. The Countess of Derby would hear about it by Thursday evening. Hart would appear at his club Friday morning, wearing the expression of a man who has been thoroughly right about something and is too well-bred to say so loudly, but who will say so quietly, and repeatedly, for approximately the next 6 months. The drawing rooms of London would receive the news with the mixture of satisfaction and calculation that fashionable London always brought to other people's engagements, and would have opinions, and express them, and move on to the next thing. Judge Alcott would write 6 pages when he heard the formal confirmation, which would be the longest letter of his correspondence with her, and would arrive 2 days after the announcement, and contain, somewhere in the middle pages, a sentence that she would return to many times. "The finest thing I know about you is that you asked for what you actually wanted, even when you were afraid the wanting itself was too large. It was never too large. It was exactly the right size. Eleanor Stanhope would hear the news from her father first, and would sit with it for a while, and would write a letter to Blanche that took 4 drafts, and the one she sent would say, simply, "I am glad he is less like stone. I think you may be part of why. I would like to learn to know you properly, if you are willing." She was willing. She was always willing for things that mattered. That was the thing about her that William Cavendish had recognized from across a room on a Friday evening in March, when she had not looked up when he entered, when she had been listening to an 81-year-old man tell a story, as though it were the most important story in the room, and something had shifted in his chest, and he had walked toward her, because he was not, it turned out, as capable of choosing stone as he had believed. He had been carrying the capacity to cross the room the entire time. He had simply needed a reason. She had been the reason, standing in her own light, entirely unaware of him, until she wasn't. They were married on the 14th of December, 1875, at St. George's, Hanover Square, on a cold, clear morning, with a sky the color of ice, and the sound of bells that carried across the Mayfair streets and disappeared into the cold air, like everything that goes up eventually does, cleanly, without announcement, leaving only the silence after. The newspapers covered it thoroughly. The Times called it an unexpected match, which was accurate, and said that Miss Howard, as she had been, brought qualities of intelligence and character that would serve the new Duchess of Devonshire well in her public role, which was the kind of compliment that also managed to be a kind of warning, and which Blanche read with the equanimity she brought to most warnings. The Morning Post was more interested in the settlement, which was extensive and generous, and in the guest list, which included 3 cabinet ministers, a retired prime minister, the full Howard family in their best clothes, the Countess of Derby, who sat in the 3rd row and cried, without any apparent self-consciousness, and Lord Hartington, who stood at the back and looked, for the first time in his cheerful adult life, quietly vindicated. Lady Eleanor Stanhope sat in the front row beside her husband and her brothers. She wore a dark dress, and her mother's eyes, and an expression that was not entirely simple to read. Grief, still present, as it was always present in this family, but alongside it, something that had not been there in June, something that had grown, carefully, through a summer and an autumn, across 3 visits and many conversations, and one afternoon, when she and Blanche had gone through Eleanor's old recipe books together, in the Chatsworth Library, looking for a particular cake recipe, and Blanche had said, without calculation, she wrote in the margins. She was the kind of person who wrote in the margins, and Eleanor Stanhope had looked at her and said quietly, yes, she was. After the ceremony, in the carriage, William looked at Blanche in her white dress, with her dark hair pinned under a veil, and said, "You are not wearing the coat." She looked at him. "I beg your pardon?" "The coat," he said. "The thing Eleanor used to say, that the title was a coat. You're not wearing it." "Not today," she said. "Today I am just married." He looked at her, and it was there again. Not the laugh, not exactly, but the full structure of it, everything it needed. "Yes," he said. "So am I." The carriage took them through the December London streets, and the bells were still going somewhere far behind them, and the city did its ordinary work around the extraordinary thing, which is what cities do. And inside the carriage, 2 people sat in the specific warmth of having arrived, finally, at the same place. She reached across and took his hand, which was large and warm, and had been, for 14 years, the hand of someone who had decided he did not deserve to hold anything. He held hers back. The years that came after were neither simple nor uncomplicated, because nothing real ever is. The kitchen garden at Chatsworth expanded twice in the first 5 years of the marriage. The first expansion added a new section on the west side, running along the old stone wall, which the head gardener had wanted for years, but had never been granted, because the previous plan had kept it as a utility path. Blanche asked for the expansion not because she had strong opinions about kitchen garden layout. She was honest with herself about the limits of her horticultural knowledge, but because George Percival, the head gardener who was 62, and had spent the last 30 years being right about almost everything, and being listened to about approximately half of it, had mentioned it to her in June of 1876, and she had told William, who had told the estate manager, and by September the wall was being cleared. George Percival was, afterward, not warm toward her exactly. Warmth was not his mode. But he was direct, and directness was, she understood, his version of it. He brought her, the following spring, 3 cuttings from a particularly resilient variety of lavender he had been cultivating for several years, without explanation. She planted them herself, beside the original lavender section, and said nothing to him about it, and he said nothing to her, and the lavender grew. The second expansion happened in 1879, and included a section she designed herself, with assistance from the botanist she had been corresponding with since the Royal Society lecture, the same one who had talked about the trees. He visited Chatsworth that summer and spent 3 days looking at the soil composition and had very strong opinions about what would thrive. She planted accordingly. The section grew particular and original things that did not apologize for being themselves. William came to the kitchen garden every morning that he was at Chatsworth. She knew this not because she was always there when he came, but because she could track his visits by the quality of the late mornings, the specific quiet of someone who has been outdoors, and come back inside with something resolved. He never talked about what he thought about in the garden. She never asked. Some things needed to be thought in private, and they had, between them, established very early an excellent understanding of the difference between solitude and isolation. They had arguments. Real ones, not the polite disagreements of people who have decided to perform harmony. She argued with him about land policy, and he argued back with the specific knowledge of a man who had been managing 40,000 acres for 30 years, and they were both sometimes right and sometimes wrong, and neither of them kept score, which she considered a significant achievement. She told him when he was tedious, as agreed. She had been right that he was frequently tedious on the subject of drainage systems, and she had been right that this was a contractual basis for honesty, and the arrangement worked, though it caused Lord Hartington, who witnessed it on several occasions, to make the same choked noise every time, which she found very satisfying. Eleanor Stanhope came to Chatsworth every June. The first year was careful. The second was easier. By the third, there was something that did not have a clean name, but was in the same family as trust. Not easy or automatic, but real. Built from ordinary things. The recipe books. The lavender. The afternoon when Eleanor's youngest child, a 3-year-old of tremendous personal confidence named Frederick after his great-uncle, made a determined beeline for the kitchen garden and ate something inadvisable from one of the beds, and both Eleanor and Blanche had sprinted after him across the lawn, with a speed that was completely undignified and entirely satisfying, and afterward had sat on the grass and laughed until the gardeners looked at them with polite concern. Grief did not go away. She had never thought it would. She had thought that grief was a permanent resident of certain houses and certain people, and that the correct response to it was not to pretend it wasn't there, but to make it a manageable cohabitation. William carried his grief about Eleanor with the same quiet accuracy he brought to everything, present, acknowledged, no longer sealed. On the anniversary of Eleanor's death each year he went to the kitchen garden early and stayed there alone for an hour. Blanche never interfered with this, and he never asked her to. Once, in the 2nd year of the marriage, she had asked him whether it had got easier over time. He had thought about it with the honesty she always asked for and always received. Different, he had said, finally. Not smaller, but less isolated. When I was alone it was just grief. Now it is grief alongside everything else, which changes its weight without changing its size. She had thought about this for a long time. That's quite good, she said. Yes, he said, I thought so too. The London house on Piccadilly, she reorganized in the 2nd year, which caused some raising of eyebrows among people who considered it their business, and which she ignored comprehensively. She removed several pieces of furniture she considered oppressive, and added 2 armchairs by the window in the morning room, and a small desk in the corner of the study, where she could write her letters to Judge Alcott, and the botanist, and the Member of Parliament she had been corresponding with for 3 years about women's education. The Member of Parliament had eventually stopped requiring her letters to come through intermediaries, which she considered an improvement. Judge Alcott visited them in London in the spring of 1877, and was received by William with the specific and genuine respect that Blanche had expected from a man who was fully capable of recognizing, in an elderly retired judge, the person most responsible for making her the kind of person she was. They talked for 3 hours about criminal law reform, and the judge's growing dissatisfaction with his physician, and the state of the roads in Bath. William asked questions. The judge answered them. Blanche sat nearby and read her book, and listened to the two most intellectually honest people she knew, becoming, without apparent effort, something close to friends. She wrote about it in her journal that night, not a formal journal, just the notebook she had kept since she was 12, in which she wrote things she thought about when the thinking was clear enough to be worth recording. She wrote, "He asks real questions. He always has, but I think I understand now what that costs, for a man who has been alone for a very long time. Real questions mean real interest, and real interest means real exposure. The possibility of finding something that matters, and therefore the possibility of losing something that matters." He spent 14 years very carefully not finding anything that mattered, and now here he is at 10:30 in the evening, deep in a conversation with a 68-year-old judge about the reform of sentencing guidelines, and he is completely, genuinely present, as though the room has been unlocked. She paused, pen in hand. She wrote, "I think this was always the room. I think the room was always here. It just needed someone to walk through the door and leave it open." She closed the journal. Outside the bedroom window of the London house, the April night was doing what April nights did, still carrying the last of winter in it, but with the smell of the approaching season just underneath, the smell of something deciding. William came in from his dressing room and saw the journal on the bedside table and said, "Are you writing about the judge?" "About you," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed, with the specific quality of someone who has learned, imperfectly, but genuinely, that being written about by the person who knows you best is not something to be afraid of. And you ask real questions," she said. "That's all. It's a good quality." He looked at her for a moment with the gray eyes that she had been, for 2 years now, learning the full grammar of, the specific vocabulary of what they said when they were close, and the night was quiet, and the required performances of the day were done. "I learned it," he said, "from a woman who told me I was standing in her light." "She sounds insufferable," Blanche said. "Yes," he said, "magnificently so." She put out the lamp, and the room went dark, and the London night went on outside, full of its ordinary business, and the two of them lay in the quiet and the dark that was not lonely at all, and were, simply, present, which is the whole of it, really. The whole of it. The room unlocked. The door open. The light let in at last. In the years that followed, there were other letters, other arguments, other summers at Chatsworth, and winters in London, and visits to the Scottish Lodge, and the quarterly headaches of the Irish property, and grandchildren from Eleanor Stanhope, and more, from the younger Cavendish children, who married in the years after, and a great deal of kitchen garden, and the ongoing slow negotiations between George Percival and the section of decorative plants, which by 1882 had expanded to include a species of climbing rose that Percival declared unmanageable, and then spent 4 weeks learning to train along the east wall, precisely to his satisfaction. There were also mornings at the window, both of them, sometimes, in the same window, looking out at whatever the morning was doing. Not always talking, sometimes just there. Both present, both looking at the same world, in the particular ease of two people who have found that the same space is large enough for both of them. He lived to 74. She outlived him by 11 years, and spent those years as she had always spent her time, reading, writing, arguing, corresponding with judges and botanists and members of various parliamentary committees, and visiting the kitchen garden at Chatsworth every June, which she had been given the permanent and explicit right to do in the settlement drawn up in 1875. She visited the lavender section specifically. Every time. She sat in the garden and thought about a man who had been sealed inside himself for 14 years, and had crossed a room because a girl he had never met was looking at something else, and he had noticed the not looking, and had crossed the room, and had found, on the other side of the crossing, that the world was larger than he had remembered. She thought about the trees feeding each other underground, about the network that no one sees from above, doing its patient and invisible work, passing what is needed from the one that has it to the one that needs it, in the dark, in the roots, without announcement or audience, simply because that is what the network does. That was what it had been, she thought, between the two of them. That was the truest name for it. Not a romance exactly, or not only. A network. An underground thing. Steady and specific, and entirely, magnificently alive. The lavender bloomed every year in the new section of the kitchen garden. George Percival maintained it, and then his successor, and then a young gardener named Arthur who had come to Chatsworth at 22 with particular ideas about soil composition that Blanche had found very interesting and had written to the botanist about, and who had been hired on that basis, which George Percival's ghost was almost certainly not reconciled to, but which George Percival himself had, in the last year of his life, grudgingly acknowledged as a reasonable decision. Arthur had his own opinions about the lavender. He was not, he informed the Duchess, entirely convinced by the original cultivar selection, and he had 3 alternatives he would like her to consider, and he had data, which he produced from a notebook the same size as the one she had brought to the botanical lecture 30 years ago. She looked at the notebook. She looked at Arthur. "Show me," she said. He showed her. The lavender section expanded again that year, which the Cavendish family noted with the mild bewilderment of people watching something continue to grow long after they had expected it to stop. It was, said Eleanor Stanhope's daughter, who was 17, and had her grandmother's eyes, and her grandmother Eleanor's habit of saying the direct thing, the most alive part of the garden. It was the most alive part of the garden. It was planted in layers, the original lavender that William had planted in memory of Eleanor, the cuttings George Percival had brought without explanation in the year after the marriage, the new cultivars Arthur had proposed and Blanche had approved, and between all of them, the particular variety she had chosen herself. After 3 years of correspondence with the botanist, which flowered later than the others, and in a slightly different shade, the deepest of all the blues in the section, appearing each year after the others were finished, as though it had decided to wait and see what happened first, and then add its own word at the end. She sat with it every June. She sat in the kitchen garden with the smell of lavender and the sound of bees, and the Derbyshire light at its longest and warmest, and she thought about everything that had grown here, the plants and the seasons and the slow, unhurried, entirely honest work of a life shared between 2 people who had started from opposite sides of the same great aloneness and had arrived, by small degrees and real increments, at the same place. The place was this: the kitchen garden in June, the roots going down, the light coming in. The network working underground, patient and invisible and alive, passing what is needed between the ones who have it and the ones who need it, in the ordinary way of things that love without announcement, without performance, without anything at all except the true and steady fact of themselves. That was the whole of it. That was, she thought, on the last June she came, sitting in the garden she had watched grow for 37 years, in the long light that did not care who she was, or what title she wore, or how the morning newspapers described the life she had lived. That was exactly everything. The light, let in, still there, always there, even when she could not see it, even in the longest dark, even then.